we have a couple of presentations this afternoon. The next couple of hours we've dedicated to hearing from the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak. So I turn it over to them now to take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Elodie Prophet, and I'm a citizen of First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak of my great-great-grandmother's people. I am a member of the Crow Clan, and I am honored and privileged to work at my First Nation as the land's executive assistant. I would like to thank the elders and youth who just provided testimonies. The following presentation was prepared by the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak Lands and Resources Department.
Hi, Elenice.
Hi.
The chief was supposed to give opening comments first.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon Mervyn, and I'm the elected chief of the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak. I'm here today to talk to you about how we must work together to better protect and preserve the waters and wetlands in the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak. Our traditional territory and the waters within and upon it have been the core of our identity and way of life as Indigenous people since time immemorial. The preservation and well-being of these waters is our children's birthright. We must ensure that they remain clean and healthy so that they can sustain our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren moving forward. Our final agreement promises protection of our waters and our way of life. It promises that our cultural and spiritual connection to our traditional territory will not be severed. We need to ensure that principle, enshrined in the Constitution, Canada's highest law, is protected and preserved. Fulfilling the spirit and promise of our final agreement must drive every decision made by the Yukon Water Board and by all the co-management bodies in Yukon. The First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak does not oppose mining in general. We have lived with mining in our territory since the 19th century. Many of our people are employed in the mining industry in one way or another. We recognize the need to balance environmental protection with industrial development. But we need mining to be done right. Any mining development needs to be consistent with the Crown's obligation to the First Nations of Na-Cho, Nyak and the spirit and intent of our treaty relationship. We need mining in our traditional territory to be done in a careful and precautionary way. We need it to only occur in these parts of our traditional territory where the risks can be managed and the land can be reclaimed. And if there are questions that we can't answer, information and traditional knowledge we need to gather, land use planning we need to do, and mining activities need to be paused to let that work be done. In Chapter 11 of our final agreement, we were promised regional land use planning for our entire traditional territory. To protect the land and waters, to ensure that any development is sustainable. We have been asking for the past 25 years, but we still do not have regional land use planning for our traditional territory that was committed to our final agreement. Until public governments make good on its promises around land use planning and ensure that our people are heard, development on our wetlands need to be paused. We oppose the authorization of placer mining prior to the conclusion of the required regional land use planning process, as promised in our final agreement. Land use planning will guide development and identify where mining is and not acceptable. We cannot know where projects should and should not proceed until that work is done. The spirit and intent of our final agreement cannot be ignored. subordinated to short-term development interests. We must be treated as partners in development and decision-making in our traditional territory towards protecting and preserving our wetlands. And so today, I call on the Yukon Water Board to discharge its responsibilities when consider authorizations of proposed projects in a way that fulfills the spirit and intent of our final agreement and respects the need for land use planning to occur before development is permitted. In conclusion, I note that many of our elders and young people are with us today to speak to you on this issue. I urge you to listen to them. I urge you to hear them. And I urge you to follow their wisdom and their guidance as you proceed to make decisions. I'll see Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Mervyn. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I am Josie Tremblay, Manager for the First Nation of Na-Cho Lands and Resources Department. As Chief Mervyn stated, we are here today to discuss how we must work together to better protect and preserve the waters, wetlands, and the traditional territory of the First Nations of Na-Cho. During the course of the next hour, we will have the opportunity to listen to oral testimonies from First Nations of Na-Cho youth and elders regarding placer mining in wetlands. For the benefit of the audience, I will confirm the names and orders of presentation. We will start with Elder Jimmy Johnny. We will have youth Kadrian Hummel, Elder Frank Patterson, Elder Walter Peter. We'll have Elder Elizabeth Moses, who will be joining from the White Horse Room. We'll have a statement from Elder Evelyn Theriault to be read by our NND Heritage Manager and citizen Teresa Sampson. This will be followed with a testimony from youth Jerry Lee Bike, which will be done remotely, and Elder Christine Hager. After these testimonies, we will have a presentation by the Lands and Resources Department regarding the NND perspectives regarding mining, moreover placer mining in wetland. This will be done with our Lands Executive Assistant, Elenice Prophet. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Robert Patrick regarding land planning in a wetland context, and we'll conclude with a presentation from Legal Counsel Nuri Frame regarding the legal context, treaty rights, and Chapter 11 land use planning. Thank you. Jimmy Johnny will be coming along. Thank you, Jimmy.
Good morning, everybody, or this afternoon. I'd like to speak my language, and after that, I'm going to translate it. Is that okay with you guys? Can you hear me?
It is okay. Go ahead.
Masito, Jawa, Sekenyanti, Nankete, Seke, Leo Ne, Pujan, Sujatke, Nankar, Anite, Ne Anite, Seyan, Sana, Nyak, Uji, Yasan, Anite, Iso, Isi, Iche, Isne, Itua, Ichoi, Yaketi Sen, Chusosan Kanache, Chusosan Kanache, Jachi, to Tiato Natsati, to Asietite, Seke, Seke Hai Ni, Maku, John, Chudetsi Yatsingje, Sumto, Edu, Utsadini Hoti, Usasan Kanate, Sanjunia, Idin Chawa, not Naji, Naji, Yake Citizen. Sanga Chenche, Chunesieti, Sanchuni Yanashi, Chokchong, the citizen, Sanchu Kanate. What does that say to you guys? A water board member. Said, my name is Jimmy Johnny. Was born on the river, Stone Street River, under tent in my dad's wood camp. And I grew up down 17 Mile. Traveled all over this area. My parents, my grandma, my grandpa, my sister, and my brother. Buried to pick out traditional medicine. And on the wetland, and on the lake area, there's lots and lots of traditional medicine out there. We have to protect that for our future generation. And berries. We gotta look out for our berries. And I don't like this. You gotta be timed. So I better go. Okay. Goodbye.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Hummel. I am a youth citizen of the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyak. Na-Cho for giving me the opportunity to share some views and stories. First Nations people back then, they lived off the land without fear of losing the healthy water. And the land had an abundance of resources. The land was their grocery store. They could harvest materials to make their shelter, harvest food, and transportation. They were taught as long as you cared for the land and took only what you needed, those areas would be there for many years to support future generations. They didn't only think of themselves or what the next 10 years would bring in. They thought of everyone, even Mother Earth. Their hunting and harvesting spots were carried down for centuries to children and their children's children. The kids knew and remembered those traditions by going out with the adults and elders to practice. A lot of this knowledge has been lost today because of colonization and residential school. My great-grandmother grew up on the land. They would set up camps for a season, harvest what they needed at the time, and when they noticed the seasons changing, they'd pack up and move camp. They traveled from the Northwest Territories by foot and by dog sled over the Mackenzie Mountains in the wintertime. The wetlands helped them navigate. They lived in a time where the wilderness had an abundance of life necessities. They stretched moose hides over boat frames made of spruce wood to make canoes. This was all before Lansing's trading post was a trading post. They trap near McQuestion Lake, Rackla River, Ledoux Lake, and Hanson Lake. My grandmother, Catherine Germain, was born at a lake up the Rackla River, subsequently named Kathleen Lakes. They didn't only think, I already heard that part. Being out on the land is empowering for the youth. I know this by experience. Having youth out where they can practice their traditions and culture, they can be proud of who they are and where they came from. It helps to show them how their ancestors survived. It is not only empowering for youth, but for everyone. We also have aunties and uncles healing camps out on the land. You can find a profound sense of pride and courage when you provide for yourself as a human. In order for this to happen, we need the water, we need the plants, and we need the animals to all be healthy and chemical free so that we can have those supplies in nature whenever needed. And especially the health of the wetlands, since it's like the Brita filter of the land. It is meant to stay as healthy as possible. For a possible mining industry to go through a wetland, which could add a chemical that would suck out the nutrients from the plants or even take place of the nutrients. The wetlands are an all-natural filter, but to think of the wetlands as a filter that can clean out man-made chemicals is not right. The Earth's land can only take so much before it needs to be rejuvenated. Just like when you dissolve salt in a cup of water, the water can only take so much salt until it starts to build up as sediment at the bottom. Traditional medicines made from plants are also affected by absorbing the water and chemicals that may be in it. The medicine may not work like expected or may be turned into another type of chemical, possibly harmful to animals and plants. I got to participate in the Beaver River watershed canoe trip with CPAWS in 2019. We spent 10 days out on the land canoeing our way back to Mayo from McQuestion Lake. This trip is what showed me how important our Yukon watersheds and wetlands are. Being out on the land has taught me firsthand many things I didn't realize before and how lucky I am to call this backyard my traditional territory. After our first portage at the beginning of Clark Lakes, another youth, Gavin, and I were waiting for the rest of the group. We were sitting on the gunnels of our canoes, eating snacks, and I could feel Gavin about 10 feet away from me, and I could feel every step he took on this big, thick marsh. It was almost like standing on a big, mossy trampoline. I also saw how a small beaver dam is enough to change the whole layout of the wetlands. It changes the way the fish and muskrats swim through the streams. It can also make the water flood the area, leaving the long grass underwater, exposing it to a higher oxygen content, which is good for the aquatic organisms. Going down the stream to one of our next Clark Lakes, you could see bright red salmon berries hanging off the banks. There were small creeks joining in the side of the streams, and even though it was 11 p.m. at night and almost dark, you could see the clarity of this crystal blue water joining in with the stream coming from Clark Lakes. It was almost like it was reflective. Here in Mayo, I see many non-local people coming in to hunt. Why? Because we still have this diverse landscape and wetlands that make hunting easy and plentiful. We are lucky to have that last bit of that left. Soon enough, with overhunting and the local First Nations, we won't have the opportunity to teach our young ones the traditions that have been passed down. And even sooner if we take out the wetlands that the moose rely on. Thank you.
Good afternoon. To the elders, citizens of Na-Cho, Nyak, and the other people from the Yukon and also the Water Board. A lot of familiar faces, good to see you. My name is Frank Patterson, Na-Cho, Nyak citizen. This is my grandson, Cole Patterson. He's Na-Cho Nyak Dun citizen also. I'd like to speak in regards to some wetland policy and stuff, but the mining policies are over 100 years old. And if we're gonna make it happen the right way, we need to get together, all of us, at workshops and stuff, and work on this policy and procedures and stuff for the water licenses. It's very important to us, near and dear to our heart. Thank Trendick Quichin for presenting yesterday, because it's near and dear to my heart. They say there's 58.6% wetlands in the Yukon, and there's 56%, 0.56 plaster claims, and that tells me why our wetlands are doing their job. It's being kept very healthy, not down south from us, but up here in this area and north of us. It's, there's a lot of destruction happening, which we don't care for, but it's not being done right. We'd like to see that happen. Traditional uses of wetlands. We use them for the animals to heal after they've done their mating through the season. And they go back to the wetlands before they go up the hills. And they go there and they eat the minerals and everything else that they need, and the plants and the medicines and everything else, and they heal. And then they go back up on the hills. Also for our waterfowl, they come here and they molt, and they come to the wetlands, and they take all summer, and they molt and they nest and have young ones, and then they fly back. So also the mining, or pardon me, the medicine, which Jimmy talked about and touched base on, very important to us. And we're practicing a lot of medicines in our fields right now. We're teaching the young people our medicine challenges. And also it's an education factor that's involved. We go to the school, we have classes for them, we talk to them about healing with traditional medicines. Someday we're gonna have to turn to that. Cultural values of wetlands right now, water quality and quantity. We need to keep our water clean. It promotes us from flooding the wetlands. It's like a big sponge. Anything that comes along, it soaks it up, and it creates us from not being affected by the floods and stuff. The medicines, again, our cultural values, and our food and water, and our education, I've mentioned. Current uses of the wetlands. We have many to specify of waterfowl who come together in a clean and healthy wetlands where they do their nesting, and then they go away in the fall. Also our fish. Our fish congregate in those wetlands, and they feed off all the bugs that are born and raised in that wetland. That's their nourishment and their health and the minerals in the water. Other personal experiences in the wetlands, other types of wetlands. There are different types of wetlands. There's bog, swamp, marsh, and other that we also have to learn of, because the things that I'm talking about are things that were passed down to me by my elders. Robert Hager, Johnson Peter, Tommy Moses, and so on and so forth. I mentioned a few names. God bless their soul. They've moved to the spirit world, but they were able to pass it on to the generations below them. Thank God for that. So people see the wetlands. A lot of people see them as wasted space. We don't see that as wasted space. Those wetlands mean a lot to us for medicines and water, clean water. And also when pollution comes along, that wetland will take care of that pollution. The rain that brings pollution with it, all that kind of stuff, it really benefits us in the wetlands. So scientific methods, are fine and dandy. We'd love to learn that. We need our young people to learn that. But one thing we're missing, and everybody else is missing in the picture, is traditional knowledge. And that's what we have to get together for and make sure that the whole world knows about traditional knowledge when they're being taught in school. So with that, I really want to thank the Water Board for hearing what I have to say about wetlands. And I have a lot more, but just no time. I'm timed. 6 minutes is done. Na-Cho.
Good afternoon. My name is Walter Peter. I'm Na-Cho Nukdan. Being born and raised here in Na-Cho, I will bring the history of our people back to you people. Ever since I was a little boy, little baby boy, some reason I recall how people used to travel to the wetland up No-Go with dog team from the old village down here. Every household move up there every spring. And April to May 25, then they come back down. They do that to harvest what they need. Moose to make dry meat, skin. Ducks they hunt maybe just for a few days, then they let it go. They don't bother it no more because they're laying eggs. And muskrat, beaver, all that to harvest, just to make extra money to buy from the store for us to live. They don't overhunt. They only take what they need. That's how they control their games. What my dad told me when I was very young, he said, water, it's alive. It's a living thing. Everything out there is a living thing. They're spiritual. You have to respect everything you do. You do not disturb the wetland. Leave it as it is. Take what you need, but don't disturb. Just leave it be. You come back, there'll be something you want, you get it. That wetland is being put there for purpose, for us to use for all the animals in the forest to use. Tell me. That's how our teaching went. Ever since we were small. True stories that tell us the history. And the old people, I think they know better than scientists today. They know what's going to happen. They know what they're talking about. They know what to do if something happens. They're very good. They even know the future, what's coming. They tell you to be prepared. All this we've been taught. The water is most important. It's a strong thing. It gives life to Mother Earth, to everything, plants. For us to be alive today, for all the animals to use to drink and to use. All the plants in the marsh, the animals use to heal, eat themselves. And we eat the animals so we can be healthy of the plants they eat. Nutrient that goes into them, it goes into us. That's how it goes. I can't go on and on, but more better I just. Is that okay? Good day.
Thank you, Walter. Mr. Chair, now we will have a testimony from Elizabeth Moses out of the White Horse Room. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jody. I'd like to thank my colleagues of Na-Cho for having taken the opportunity to speak to the Water Board. And I'd also like to thank Toronto for their taking the initiative to speak to the Water Board about the importance of the wetlands. I'd like to start and bring the ancestors into my talk. I'd like to acknowledge my grandparents, John Martin and Bella Martin, who traveled over the mountains this way in a Musquin boat. I'd also like to thank my grandmother, my dad's side, Na-Cho. I'd like to thank Grandmother Water, Juju Etsuachu, Chua. I know Grandmother Water to be sitting at one of the 4 sacred and cardinal directions, and that Grandmother Water is important for us to live, as important as the air, as important as the sun, and that these entities work together to provide life to Mother Earth and all of creation. The 4-legged ones, the finned ones, the winged ones, the crawly ones, which is most predominant on the wetlands. As we heard from the other presentators, the importance of the wetlands and the glacier and the moss, they too work together. The riverway in the Yukon, which goes out into the great ocean, is also present in the sky. We have a river sky. And the cycle of life that the water produces worldwide brings life to all of peoples all over the world. And we have to work together and respect each other to continue life as we know it. It is crucial at this time to realize that the disease affects all of us. And we must protect the kidneys of Mother Earth. As one of the presenters said, the kidneys of Mother Earth are the wetlands. We protect also other parts of the natural world. And I want to say that I was very inspired to read from Matthew Kuhnkam's life, and what he said to his son was one of the greatest things that the ancestors left behind was to leave nature as they saw it. And that's one of the greatest legacies that we see with our own ancestors in the area of Na-Cho and the Yukon. And we talk about it often, leaving something for the future, leaving it as we see it, as we saw it, as our ancestors saw it. Chillicut, all my relations.
My name is Teresa Sampson, and I am reading a presentation on behalf of Evelyn Farrell. I am a Na-Cho elder who is very concerned about what I am seeing happening in our beautiful traditional territory. More so within the last couple of years, I have noticed increasing destruction happening, resulting in the loss of habitat, wetlands, hunting, and harvesting areas. One of my personal principal losses is the peaceful wetlands that ran along the roadways towards Minto Lake. Now it is all dug up for miles with heavy equipment in there, continuing to destroy more and more of these wetlands. The wetland is now non-existent and we will never get it back. My family and I went hunting, and on every road that we took, it had an active mine. With new roads being built seemingly everywhere, leaving mounds of gravel everywhere, looking like Dawson's dredge piles. It looks like a war zone with most of the boreal forest gone. The boreal forest is the key role player in tackling climate change, which is the habitat for wildlife and birds. The vegetation is gone, and the destruction of root systems leaves us with nothing left to control erosion. It seems as though mining companies are staking claims on lands they do not intend to mine, which will give them the ability to punch roads into their intended mining area with little or no consideration to the preservation of the environment. There are many mining claims down the length of both sides of Mayo Lake, with Dulac mining 10 kilometers from the Roop, which is the wetlands for whitefish, grayling, and pike, and is also a calving area for moose. It is home to many birds and many species of wildlife. Continuous claims with an active mine from Davidson's Bridge all the way down to the Nelson arm of Mayo Lake. South McQuestion Road has mining claims starting at the Silver Trail Highway all the way to Victoria Gold. Duncan Creek is another active mining area. We desperately need a moratorium to any further mining claims and a signed agreement from the government to limit the damage these miners inflict. One way is to introduce an enforcement of a damage deposit when applying for a water license and limitations to how many claims can be staked. All too often, there are shacks and debris left behind. It is time consuming and at a cost for the miners to take out the mine that is when a mine is abandoned. Mining companies need to be held accountable and responsible for cleaning up their mess, whether it be chemical contamination and or physical debris. Just look at what happened at Victoria Gold with the 2 major spills and countless other issues. How much cyanide from the leach pit has found its way to the groundwater or any other surface bodies of water? It recalls the Colorado Summitville mine disaster in the 1980s, which has caused extreme environmental damage and to this day is costing a forever bill of $2 million a year. When the final and self-government agreements were signed, it was with the understanding that the Yukon government and the First Nations were to become partners in managing land and resources. First Nations need to be recognized as a viable partner by the Yukon government. Failure to include us, First Nations, as partners has enticed mining companies to continue to stake mineral claims wherever they wish. Mining takes precedence when it comes to Yukon government. It should not be this way. The Mining Act is 100 years old and needs to be revised collaboratively with First Nations. There desperately needs to be collaboration between all parties. Years ago, Granite Creek began as a mom and pop placer mine, but now has been taken over by a company that has grown into a huge mine. It appears that they are now intending to include an area near a major watershed, the Mayo Lake region, which will be devastating for Na-Cho citizens as Mayo Lake is essential for hunting, fishing, and trapping. Continued mining activity does infringe on our Aboriginal rights by breaching our ability to perform our inherent and traditional and cultural practices. These are but a few of the grievances I have regarding mining. Elder Evelyn Prophet Darrow. Thank you. Next up, we will hear from Jerry Lee.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. My name is Jerry Lee Bike, and I am a First Nation of Na-Cho citizen. And I really want to say how grateful I am for my First Nation and Trondikwichin and all those the others that have spoken before me. It's been very insightful, and again, I'm very grateful for you sharing your experiences and your feelings on this. I wish that I could echo all of what you said, as I totally agree with it, but there isn't that much time. And I also want to say how happy and proud I am to see little Cole Patterson sitting there and listening in on this. This is so important. I feel that there are different versions to how people describe what they mean by being in nature and what it means to be a Yukoner and a part of the land, and everyone can be entitled to those experiences. I, for one, though, see those differences as one being mindful of the future and offering what the land can give to you, and others that are doing it in a way that is causing more harm than good, ultimately. And I want to, sorry, this is hard to speak about when it's so near and dear to your heart. It doesn't seem like those may understand what we're trying to express, like what we're losing when detrimental destruction takes place on wetlands that so many depend on. And that's why I believe that, and I'm sorry, and I do emphasize when people say that the process seems too long or they want it cut back because it's too much. However, though, this is so important for us to move forward and for us to ensure that we're leaving something good in good standing for our future generations, mine and yours. And that is why I applaud those that are taking this time, and I hope that will ensure that our voices are included along the way, because we had leaders and elders, and many who have already passed and some that are still here, who have worked so hard to achieve our final agreements, because I believe that they were really strong forward thinkers and wanted to ensure that we are all working together in a good way for ourselves and for our children. So I really hope that, the way that exploration takes place now is the way that happened compared to the way it happened 50 to 100 years ago. I think it's not quite the same at all. I think now there's bigger machines, and it gets the job done faster, and in that way it can cause a lot more accidents that are irreversible, and that causes us to react to it. Those that are from the land, those that are in the communities and depend on the health and well-being of the water and animals and the medicines. And as Elder Walter Peter had said, the water does have a spirit, and that is something that I felt ever since I've become empowered through the land, through the Peel, through the Beaver River, and I really believe that needs to continue to be there for our young people, because that is where we are reconnecting, and that is where we are going to empower our youth to become strong once again, because that was taken away from us, and that has taken a long time for us to try and regain. So I hope that moving forward, that the board and all those working on this on the other side, and that this requires a lot of thoughtfulness and forward thinking once again, and a lot of heart, because we are also grateful and proud to be from the Yukon, and because of what it gives back, but we need to ensure that our policies are strong and that it's upholding, again, the well-being and spirit of the water and land over gold when it is necessary, when it is absolutely necessary too. And I hope that our Yukon First Nation representatives through this process will be at the table, and please be always mindful of our agreements and taking the time to understand how those play a strong influence for you and I, our loved ones, and our future children. Na-Cho, I plan on writing to the board as well, as again, there isn't too much time, but thank you so much for listening.
Mr. Chair, we now have Elder Christine Hager with her oral testimony. Sure.
Good afternoon. My name is Christine Hager. I'm an elder of First Nation of Na-Cho. My parents were Jenny and Frank Germain, and my late husband, former chief of Na-Cho, Robert Hager. I was born in the old village of Mayo and was raised in my father's trapline, and which was Patterson Range at trapline 83. My parents and relatives live and work together on trapline, which was on northeast of Keno and Elsa, practicing our traditional lifestyle of hunting, fishing, and harvesting. We travel on to Hanson Lake, McQuestion Lake, and Ladue Lake, right through to the headwater of Sturt River. There are many wetlands in these areas, which is being disturbed by the mining, and Keno Hill and Calumet was one of them that disturbed the water. I have learned from my ancestors and my husband, and I try to pass the knowledge of the traditional medicine which came from the wetland. Our family established our fish camp in 1980 along the Sturt River in the recent years, and it became surrounded by mining activities today, and now we cannot swim or drink the water anymore. This is why I spoke today. I believe the wetland is important to our future young generation and about protecting the water. Wetland was important to us, and animals and birds and beaver, any animal on the land was important to us and for you. We have seen a lot of changes on the land, water, and plants and animals. We need to protect the wetland for our future generation and vision for our generation. We have to learn and teach and learn from each other and work together with trust. Na-Cho, thank you. And these are our generations here. And this one here is the future generation and him too. And he's a Na-Cho, and he's a community at large. I don't know if they have something to say.
Hello, I'm Cole Patterson. I'm a citizen of Na-Cho and keep the water clean, and then so we could go hunting and practice with our grandparents and parents.
Thank you.
My name is Isaac. Please protect the water. Water is life. I want, please keep it healthy until the future generations. Na-Cho.
Mr. Chair, now we will go ahead with a presentation from our Lands and Resources Department. Go ahead, Elenise. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies for speaking out of line earlier. I'm very embarrassed for that, but Stefan is taking care of the slide and I will be doing the reading. My name is Alanese Prophet and I am a citizen of First Nation of Na-Cho, of my great-great-grandmother's people. I am a member of the Crow clan and I am honored and privileged to work at my First Nation as the land's executive assistant. I would like to thank the elders and the youth who just provided testimonies. The following presentation was prepared by the First Nation of Na-Cho Lands and Resources Department. First Nation of Na-Cho citizens continue to live on their ancestral lands. Their occupancy of the traditional territory predates the mineral development in the region and encompasses a vast and intimate understanding of the environment and natural resource management. The First Nation of Na-Cho Lands and Resources Department is guided by the Lands and Resources Act, which is a reflection of the membership's relationship with and their understanding of the natural world. The objectives listed on the slide from the Lands and Resources Act pertain directly to the protection and appropriate management of wetlands. Please understand the matter of wetlands management as being entirely integrated with the mandate and purpose of the Lands and Resources Department as it was envisioned by NND membership. As we continue to strive for successful co-management and co-governance of Yukon's lands and resources, and in light of continued challenges faced by First Nations in implementing this co-management regime, we wish to exemplify the vital importance of understanding different, often disparate knowledge systems. The traditional ways of knowing inherent in First Nation approaches to resource management must be comprehensively understood and met not only with respect, but also with the willingness to implement appropriate tools and policies for their successful incorporation in the management of Yukon's wetlands. The following portion of the presentation is meant to build on the testimonies you have just heard and identify how an NND understanding of wetlands may provide some context to the board in considering steps forward that allow for the respect and necessary co-management of these vital habitats. The quotations listed on the slides, which will be expanded upon in First Nation of Na-Cho written submissions to the board, are directly reflective of different concepts and understandings of what a wetland is and means. As biophysical features, wetlands contribute special ecological functions and values. They accumulate carbon, moderate water runoff, recharge groundwater, provide flood control, sediment trapping, denitrification. They have disproportionate value to fish and wildlife and provide important cultural and spiritual needs. The NND understanding of wetlands and their benefit does not end where land and water meet. Without consideration for benefits that extend beyond this interface, mapping and delineations of wetlands are likely to underestimate the area of benefit and potential impacts that must be mitigated for proper wetland maintenance. Identification of wetlands, travel routes, and traditional use areas by NND citizens indicates that wetland complexes and the interconnectivity of wetland forms a pivotal basis for how people interact with and manage lands and waters under their stewardship. For the NND, there is an understanding of the interconnectivity of all lands and waters within traditional territory, which functions and interacts as one body. In one way, water is the heart and wetlands are the lungs. The relationship First Nations people and their culture have with wetlands is an intrinsic and holistic one. It cannot be categorized, subdivided, or partitioned on any map. While the services wetlands provide locally, regionally, and globally are often intangible and invaluable, the reliance of First Nations on wetland environments can be directly linked to entrenched treaty rights, including Chapter 14 rights. Water quality and quantity protection on a regional scale lies at the heart of First Nation concern for wetland health. Understandably, the First Nation of Na-Cho view the landscape in a manner which is fundamentally different from an industrialist, consumerist perspective. Ancestral meeting places, healing places, and hunting and gathering camps are often located adjacent to wetlands, with seasonal travel taking place along wetland corridors or from one wetland complex to another. The abundance of fish and wildlife associated with these regions is tied directly to their importance. Detailed and consistent wetland mapping and classification is therefore essential prior to any activity being contemplated on or near wetlands. Identification of conservation areas and key wetlands to be set aside with full protection from development must occur in concert with associated planning processes. Furthermore, incorporating the First Nation of Na-Cho understanding of landscape connectivity and a holistic perspective of wetland management is paramount to further establishing ecologically appropriate thresholds of disturbance and socially acceptable standards for reclamation. Such thresholds are absolutely necessary before any future development in wetlands can be contemplated at this time. As an example of an area of considerable importance in Na-Cho traditional territory, we would like to highlight Granite Creek within the Mayo Lake and Mayo River drainage. Granite Creek is known locally as the most important grayling spawning creek within the Mayo River drainage. The headwaters of this creek begin at a high elevation plateau, which hosts an unmapped wetland complex. If you had come to the spot not so many years ago, you would have seen moose browsing in the wetland. The certainty of seeing moose here was such that a small hunting shot sat precariously at the edge of the moose pasture. In the testimonies you just heard, one elder described the transition of that plateau to its current state. Impacts of placer mining on wetlands often result from such activity as hydraulic and mechanical stripping, removal or alteration of the permafrost layer, and altering flow direction and rates through diversions in ditches. The long-term impacts of these alterations on their own can be damaging and often irreversible. However, these actions in combination with other industrial activities and the unpredictable pressures of climate change may impact wetlands and wetland complexes in immeasurable ways. Today, there are 8 existing Class 4 placer water licenses on Granite Creek and the connected Keystone Creek, for which the wetlands in the plateau forms a watershed divide. Continued staking and exploration has reached into the tributaries of both creeks. Granite Creek feeds directly into the Root Lakes wetland complex at the northeast end of the root arm of Mayo Lake. This area is a nexus of biological productivity and has had a long history of use and special importance by the First Nation. First Nation local use of this area continues to this day. However, it has been heavily and negatively impacted by vast environmental change already. The Roops are a series of small shallow lakes located at the eastern edge of Mayo Lake. Until recently, there was a healthy population of beaver, muskrat, and otter that use this area. Waterfowl are abundant. Grayling spawn up Granite Creek and whitefish spawn at the mouth of the wetlands. The wetland feeds into Mayo Lake, which through the Mayo Lake Dam drains into the Mayo River to the town of Mayo. Salmon and freshwater fish species once traveled the river to spawn in Mayo Lake and the wetlands, but this is evidently no longer the case. The impacts of water level fluctuation resulting from hydroelectric power generation has already had a large negative impact on the Roop wetlands. A longtime harvester of the Mayo River, Mayo Lake, and Roop wetlands has documented that there are already no more beaver or muskrat and a decrease in otter, moose, and wolves. Abundance of wildlife has decreased exponentially in recent years due to increased variation in water levels in the lake. Sedimentation in the Roop Lakes wetlands has already been observed due to existing placer operation upstream on Granite Creek. The impacts of potential and likely mining within wetlands on Granite Creek will be multifold, as it will not only impact the function and use of the higher elevation wetlands within existing claim blocks, but also have potential negative effects on downstream wetlands already being heavily altered by other factors. Local observation of sedimentation a few kilometers into the Roop wetlands and resulting negative impacts on grayling fishing and observed grayling presence this year may be a small taste of what's to come with increased placer activity and wetland destruction and conversion upstream on Granite Creek. The connectivity of this entire system and the link between regions for proper maintenance of water quality directly points to a necessity for A, comprehensive wetland mapping and classification, B, integrated modeling of benefits and relationship of wetlands to landscape scale processes, C, adequate regional planning which develops regional disturbance thresholds, both ecological and sociocultural, based on available scientific and traditional knowledge. D, the need for watershed level cumulative impact studies. And E, identification of conservation areas and wetlands set aside for full protection from development. In addition, planning and threshold determination should incorporate temporal and geographic spacing of projects in order to ensure thresholds are not exceeded. Wetland benefits are maintained, and First Nation use in connection with areas can be sustained. Many wetland areas and complexes have been identified by local First Nations as deserving of future study, research, planning, and protection. Among these are the Roop Lakes Wetland Complex and associated Granite Creek wetlands, the McQuestion Lake wetlands, and downstream wetlands within the McQuestion River Valley, and the low-lying wetlands of the Stewart River Valley. The McQuestion River Valley has seen incredible impacts due to mining over the past century, including the major Keno Hill Silver District, which has resulted in an environmental disaster, having contaminated many of the creeks and wetlands in the Keno-Elsa area. In addition to the contamination from Elsa and Keno, the McQuestion Valley now accepts all the discharge from the Yukon's largest hard rock gold mine, Victoria Gold, along with many other placer operations which continue within the Haggard Creek drainage. Impacts within the McQuestion Valley, including the lower McQuestion, which is a location of extreme cultural importance, hosting known wetlands, includes the following. Over a century of hard rock mining impacts and water quality degradation, associated large-scale logging to support mine operations, commercial fish and wildlife harvesting and depletion to support mine operations, and continued placer mining on McQuestion Mainstream and its tributaries. In addition to existing industrial disturbances and contamination, indirect impacts on fish, wildlife, and wetland habitats, the effects of climate change are already being keenly observed by our membership. This includes the observation of a number of lakes and wetlands drying up, especially within the Stewart Valley lowlands. Increased permafrost melting also has a direct and noticeable effect on wetlands, as permafrost occurrence is integral to wetland form and function in central Yukon. Beyond the site-specific or even regional scale, permafrost melting is contributing to increased atmospheric carbon across the circumpolar north in a worrying and ever-increasing rate. Impacts of placer mining on wetlands and associated permafrost systems need to include an understanding of these impacts, contribution to regional and global carbon emissions within the context of necessary climate targets and climate change strategies. Financial and practical compensation and costing must be integrated in regional permitting approaches, license terms and conditions, security costing, and reclamation goals and standards. Wetlands reclamation efforts currently involve a focus on conversion of previous habitats into shallow water swamps. Such habitats may appear to have higher bioactivity from increased use by visible species such as moose and waterfowl. However, overall degradation and alteration of the function of complex peatlands such as fens is of the utmost concern on a landscape regional scale. Peat accumulation is a complex process dependent on simultaneous accumulation and decomposition with a positive balance. Restoration of fens requires stable and calcium-rich groundwater of low salinity flowing into low gradient areas. Even with 1 to 3 millimeters of peat accumulation per year, approximately 1 to 3 centuries would be needed to generate 30 centimeters of accumulated peat to qualify as a peatland. Although permitting a project on or adjacent to a wetland may be limited to the term of the water license, project renewal, and the process of reclamation may exclude the public from the area for more than 50 years. The project area may subsequently never see the same wetland conditions return as was present historically. The regional impacts of the loss of a wetland or a wetland complex is not understood, particularly in the context of currently degraded areas within traditional territory. Furthermore, it is unlikely that hunters, trappers, and gatherers, and those First Nation citizens that simply wish to have a presence on the land will retain detailed knowledge of exclusion zones for several decades. In NND traditional territory, such impacts and exclusion zones are currently being exhibited in Keno and Elsa, Minto Creek, Granite Creek, Clear Creek, and Haggard Creek, to name a few. Given the context of increasing impacts to weather patterns and hydrological cycles in the north due to climate change, the services wetlands provide are even more vital and worthy of protection. Adequate reclamation measures continue to be an issue in general with respect to placer mining impacts within NND traditional territory. The fragility and vital importance of wetland ecosystems and the complexity of reclamation success for wetlands heighten the standards and measures required on a license-by-license basis. In essence, there remains a vital need to carry out the appropriate planning, wetland identification, research and policy development in advance of any more work contemplated. These processes will guide the information necessary to be included in appropriate and accepted wetlands reclamation plans. In the presentations to follow, the need for adequate planning will be contextualized as the first necessary step in proper wetland management. For the purposes of our contribution, we have summarized specific recommendations to the board in the current slide. In essence, we are calling on the board to implement the right order of actions within their powers, so appropriate measures can take place for the assurance that vital wetland complexes will continue to provide their integral contribution to First Nation health, well-being, and connection to the land for generations to come. Na-Cho.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Elenise. And Mr. Chair, we'll now go ahead with a presentation from Dr. Patrick. He should be tuning in from his remote location.
Hello, I am here. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you.
Can you see a presentation?
We can see you. We can't see your presentation yet. We can see the presentation now.
Okay. Apologies for this. How does that look?
Very good.
Good. I will just start in then. Thank you very much for this invitation to present to the Yukon Water Board on the topic of placer mining in wetlands. My presentation outline for today, I'll give a brief introduction of who I am and how I came to be involved with NND on this presentation. I will speak briefly about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals because I think there's a broader piece here that needs to be brought into the discussion. I'll speak briefly, fairly briefly, about wetland function versus wetland values. And I will do my best to focus more on Indigenous planning and as well as something known as parallel planning, or the parallel planning of Western planning with Indigenous planning. And then a few comments about next steps. So as a self-introduction, I'm a registered professional planner and I'm a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. I have 12 years planning experience in the past with the Sunshine Coast Regional District in Coast Salish Territory, British Columbia. I did my PhD in water protection, drinking water protection at the University of Guelph. And I teach now at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Geography and Planning. Internationally, I've worked as a regional planner in Australia, and I've worked on Indigenous water planning issues in Peru. Source water protection planning with First Nations, and more recently, climate change adaptation planning with First Nations is the focus of my research. And that research is really community-based work that I do in and with communities, principally in Saskatchewan, but also Alberta and British Columbia. And my teaching, as I mentioned, is at the University of Saskatchewan in watershed management, sustainable communities, and regional planning with graduate and undergraduate students. My connection to Na-Cho Nyak is really came about after the AFN climate summit, climate gathering that was held in Whitehorse last March. And I had the pleasure and honor of meeting Chief Mervyn at that time. And Chief Mervyn spoke very passionately about the water issues that are occurring and in his territory in the Yukon. And from that discussion over coffee, I returned to the U of S and applied for a small research grant to explore community-based research needs with Na-Cho Nyak. Then along came COVID, so I have not been able to visit the community, and I look forward to doing that in the near future as a potential community-engaged project. I will say, though, that was my second trip to the Yukon. My first trip was as a young undergraduate student in the late 1970s, so that tells you how old I am, working at Faro as a surveyor's assistant at the Cypress anvil mine in the late 70s. So jumping in with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. I'm sure you're well aware of these. And one that has caught my attention and the attention of many at the University of Saskatchewan is clean water and sanitation. And with that, it's pretty clear that we have a water problem. Not just a climate problem, but we have a water problem globally with 3 in 10 people lacking access to safely managed drinking water, water scarcity affecting more than 40% of the global population. More than 80% of wastewater resulting from human activities is discharged into rivers or seas without pollution removal. Floods and other water-related disasters account for 70% of all deaths related to natural disasters. And the clean water and sanitation goal 6 targets, so these are targets set by the UN, include by 2030 equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water. By 2030, which is just 10 years from now, equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, improved water quality by reducing pollution and eliminating dumping and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials, ensuring sustainable withdrawals and supply of fresh water to address water scarcity, and implementing integrated water resource management at all levels. And by 2020, this year, protecting and restoring water-related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, and lakes. And supporting and strengthening the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. So safe drinking water, those goals and targets from the United Nations, how does that affect Canadians, in particular Yukoners? Well, safe water for Canadians, it comes down to where you live and who you are. If you're Indigenous and living on a reserve, you don't enjoy the same access to safe water as other Canadians. 134 water systems in 85 First Nation communities were reported to be in the boil water advisory. 1 in 8 First Nations communities is under boil water advisory at any one time. Boil water advisory is 2.5 times more frequent for First Nations than for non-First Nations. And waterborne infections in First Nation communities an alarming 26 times higher than the Canadian national average. About 39% of First Nations water systems today remain as rated as high risk from Health Canada. And just watching the news almost weekly, there's some significant problem reported across Canada. The Skanantanga First Nation water crisis ongoing right now, formerly known as Lansdowne House, where I believe they went over 13 years on a boil water advisory. So in my work, I focus on drinking water and source water protection. And so looking at how we can better protect sources of water so that our water treatment works more effectively. And in the end, our water distribution system and water delivery systems into communities is safer. So protecting the source. And this, of course, was what went wrong at Walkerton and later at North Battleford. And what is wrong in so many Indigenous communities is that the source of water cannot or has not been adequately protected. So I refer to wetlands here, and I put in this slide as wetlands as an indicator of water security. The Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, where I'm affiliated, they're doing work around the globe on water security, and in particular, water in Canada. And it appears that Canada is not as water rich as we once thought we were, and all the more reason to protect our sources of water. Wetlands would be a wonderful place to start. And while I'm not a wetland scientist and I don't pretend to be a natural scientist, I'm a planner and social scientist, It's easy to see, and you've heard already today from some wonderful speakers about the benefits of wetlands and all that they do to dissipate stream energy, to break down bacteria and contaminants, to release water slowly into rivers and streams, and to provide amazing wildlife habitat, and also to store carbon. So our climate problem is also in part mediated through good management of our wetland ecosystems. And as the first youth speaker so eloquently and accurately said, wetlands are the Brita filter on the land. The only difference between, of course, a Brita filter and the wetland is the wetlands are free. So there are many threats to drinking water. We know what they are. They're all around us. And in a watershed planning or a source water protection planning process, we would do our best to understand the subsurface conditions, time travel of contaminants to a wellhead, and try and delineate the boundary of that source water protection area. And this would take time, it would take mapping, it would take a consolidated effort to do some serious planning on the landscape. What I understand from some of the water systems in the Yukon is that they are wells, often shallow wells, close to rivers or lakes or wetlands. And my guess is that these wells are typically in unconfined aquifers, meaning that they're above any sort of clay lens or hard rock, bedrock that would provide some protection or barrier to any contaminant that's coming from the surface. These are referred to often as groundwater under direct influence or goody wells. So function of wetlands, tremendous water filters, looking after turbidity and sediment control, safe drinking water, I've mentioned that, and the uptake of contaminants. Water storage, wetland functions like natural tubs or sponges. We've heard that from previous speakers. They provide this flood protection as well, and human safety and erosion control. Tremendously biologically productive, the most biologically productive environments in the world. Wetlands are areas for fish habitat, berries, and medicines. And I've mentioned carbon storage to moderate global climate conditions. The value of wetlands. So value, value is different than function. Function is how they operate and what they provide. Value is really what they returned in terms of a dollar value. Tremendous avoidance of flood damage and erosion control. I've mentioned already drinking water purification, carbon sequestration, ecotourism, hunting, fishing, trekking, paddling. Economists can actually put dollar values on this, and there are economists at the U of S who are doing this work right now. Ken Belcher is one who's able to actually put a dollar value, and it's not a tricky piece of work. It's quite simple. Not for me, I'm not an economist, but for them to put a dollar value on all of these values that are provided by wetlands. So looking at the economic returns of something like mining, it's important to balance that against what are the other values that are provided from wetlands. In ecological services, which are maybe more difficult to measure in terms of food chain and habitat, what is the cost of losing that habitat? Human health and wellness, water, and pandemics. So COVID-19, we're realizing now the importance of clean water, how important clean water is and water is to combat COVID-19 and the spread of pandemics. And COVID-19 is but one. There will be more coming our way. And water is so critical to this. So this is a whole new dimension to the importance of water in our environment. And for Indigenous peoples, traditional foods, medicines, and of course, access to drinkable water that is not chlorinated. I've spoken with many elders who dislike chlorinated water. They see it as a poison. And of course, chlorine is a poison. And to poison something that is life-giving is counter to traditional knowledge. So we must be mindful of that as we move forward. And Indigenous culture, spiritual services, and placemaking. And we heard from elders just earlier. Indigenous ways of knowing. And again, this refers to ancestral knowledge, understanding the past and taking lessons from the past. Indigenous ways of knowing would be counter to Western science, but I think often complementary to, and when the two are working together, we can see the validation of one with the other. And so I also put in place here the 7 generations model. Ted Hohoya from Arizona State University talks about the 7 generations model, the 3 generations preceding us, the current generation, and the 3 future generations is what I understand to be the planning horizon for Indigenous peoples versus the more Western science, which is sort of planning for today, maybe for tomorrow, but tomorrow just being often 1 generation away. So when we think about the value of wetlands, we must take in the 7 generations model, which is an Indigenous perspective on planning and ways of knowing. I found this slide to be quite interesting of Old Crow Flats. I've never visited this area, but it appears that there are some significant changes in surface area of water. The surface area of water is declining. It was increasing for a period, 51 to 72. It appears from 72 to 2001. It's old data. I don't know what it would be, what these numbers would look like now. And the reason for this decrease of 8.5% appears to be a collapse of permafrost. So water is being able to melt and spill and leave the landscape. And also climate warming, so evapotranspiration. So back to our goals. We focused on clean water and sanitation. I would argue, and I think most of you would agree, that we could actually expand that to include good health and well-being. Certainly the elders were speaking of this particularly well, as well as the youth. Life on land, the youth paddling trip spoke to a life on the land and experiencing the land. Also, life below water. If we're talking about wetlands, we're also talking about life below water. And I would also go to the left there. Climate action would be very, very, I think, important in this area as well. So the Sustainable Development Goals, when you apply them to wetlands, it's more than just water. And the slide I put together was really wetlands and sustainability, coming back to this notion of sustainability and what might it look like. And I think if we focus solely on the environment, which sort of maybe a 1970s, 1980s perhaps perspective, looking at just the economy, 1970s, 1980s, we began to think more consciously about the environment. And then by the 1980s, we were thinking more about cultures and societies. And so when you overlap these three from the Brundtland Report, 1984, 85, we see that sustainability is really the confluence of these three, not just thinking about the economy and tax dollars or revenues or monies that might come in from mining interests or oil or revenues from dam profits, but considering also the environment and society. We can't deal with one without thinking of all three of these. So we're losing wetlands. We have a wetland problem and a water problem. And what is the problem? And I think, you know, the villain in the room is all of us or most of us. It's really how we live. How we live. So there's economic opportunities from hunting and fishing and ecotourism. There's support for Indigenous and non-Indigenous culture and social connectivity to the land. So that's the social connection in the sustainability model. But also wetland ecology. So the wetland ecological, physical, and chemical functionality of wetlands. So wetlands really do embrace the whole spectrum of sustainability, economic, social, and environment or ecology. So wetland loss and how we live. Well, we'll just step back for a moment and look at what happened in August of 2017 to the south, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. Land use planners at the time for the city of Houston were crying loudly that the development on the fringe of the city, the suburban areas, and the clearing of wetlands and the expansion of the city and the hardening of the surface, roads and driveways and pavement and low density development was going to become a problem with water flow. And lo and behold, they were right. They were absolutely right. And the flood problem there was largely a land use problem where lands had been converted from wetlands, these large sponges on the land, to suburban growth and suburban development. And the result was that flooding disaster. Was it a weather problem? Not so much. It was, or a climate problem, perhaps, and we're going to see more of these climate events. But the real problem was a land use problem. Closer to home in my own city, Saskatoon, there's a constant battle over wetland loss. The city is expanding in all directions and taking up these valuable wetlands. The prairies, as you know, the numbers range from 70 to 90% of the prairie wetland, the prairie pothole region, has been reworked, and the impact around the city is tremendous. And the result of this, the cost of this, will greatly outweigh the profits taken from any subdivision development. Still closer to home, an area where I've worked, the Saskatchewan River Delta, the construction of the EB Dam Wilcam and the loss of water into the Delta. The lower center picture is the water intake to the northern village of Cumberland House, high and dry a few summers back. And the introduction of invasive species, Phragmites, weed that is growing and actually taking over the wetland delta. So the delta is turning into land. Wetland loss globally, it's disappearing far too quickly. And we know this well from the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, 1971. Ramsar was initiated. 40% of the world's species live and breed in wetlands. Much of this you've heard already, but I just wanted to remind the board of the importance of wetlands, and that these are total economic value of wetlands, something like 5 times higher than tropical forests, and tropical forests being the most valuable terrestrial habitat. And wetlands actually contribute to 75 indicators of sustainable development in the goals. When you look at the actual indicators for sustainable development, 75 of those are wetland related. And by far the world's most valuable ecosystem. So there's a necessity of developing effective wetland management plans, of integrating wetlands into planning and implementation of plans on sustainable development, on the sustainable development paradigm, integrating wetlands into planning and implementation of plans on climate change. The Global Wetlands Outlook report stresses good governance and effective institutions at all levels in preventing, ending, and reversing trends in wetland loss. And this is something that I stress in my teaching that, and maybe the scientists will get after me, but I think largely the science has figured this out. The problem is good governance and effective institutions and human communication. That is what I believe is holding us back in moving forward in a way that will be good for everyone. And accurate data on wetland extent and wetland inventories. This to me all speaks to the importance of good planning on the land. And including in that, absolutely at the front end, Indigenous and local knowledge, as well as citizen scientists, are invaluable resources on the state of wetlands. So we all have some work to do. What is the role of Western planning? Well, Western planning was designed to oversee orderly growth and development, to protect property values, to solve past and present development issues, to maintain the public interest, and to achieve aspirations for the built and natural environment. What is planning? Well, I guess it's an English word for a universal function. The Canadian Institute of Planners, where I'm a member, see it as a professional practice. I teach in a planning school, in a planning program. And most of us teach that planning originated with Europeans. Up until a few years ago, I certainly fell into that trap. And yet, planning, what is it? It's really a scholarly and professional practice of the colonizer. But planning is not owned by the colonizer. There is something known as Indigenous planning, and it is on the rise, I would say, in the last decade, in terms of being an academic subject. But Indigenous planning has been along forever. It has a long and rich history of the family, of the clan, of settlements, of where people would live, when they would migrate, their hunting patterns, their ceremony, their medicines, where they would collect medicines. All of that was intricately tied to the land and to the people and to decisions, life and death decisions about how to move over the land. And so this was absolutely important planning work. And as Harini Matunga, a Maori Indigenous scholar says, Maori scholar says, life was certainly not random in the past in Indigenous culture. It certainly wasn't unorganized or haphazard or without purpose. It was very well planned. It had to be to survive. So where does Western science come into any of this? Indigenous communities in Canada continue to be negatively impacted by upstream water resource and land use development activities. Western science and water resource planning and management approaches have in the past offered very little space for Indigenous engagement, resulting in lost opportunities for collaboration, for partnership, and for reconciliation. As a consequence, many past and present land use planning practices in Canada have mostly served to reproduce colonial relations that are nested in conflict and mistrust between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities. And this is where we're at today in many communities in Canada and around the world. Modern, or what I call Western planning policies and practice, continue to be applied to and over landscapes that have long constituted traditional lands of Indigenous occupants, dismissing Indigenous rights and title. By privileging legislated policies and procedures of the state, modern planning consistently excludes well-established Indigenous planning practices. And we heard that, I think, from an elder earlier. Despite a decade of legal precedent, consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities remains the exception rather than the norm. When it comes to land and resource planning in Canada, despite Supreme Court of Canada rulings that the Crown owes a duty to consult Indigenous people on matters affecting treaty or Aboriginal rights. So what does Indigenous planning look like, and what are the aims of Indigenous planning? Well, political autonomy and advocacy, environmental quality and quantity, social cohesion and well-being, economic growth and distribution, and cultural protection and enhancement. Who wouldn't agree that these are noble aims of planning, of any form of planning, but of Indigenous planning in particular? Indigenous planning process is guided by principles. And these 6 principles, again from Harini Matunga, really help us understand and guide us through the planning process for Indigenous communities. The first is people, Indigenous participants with ancestry and kin connections, decision-making for natural resources in traditional territory, exactly what we're talking about here today, and cultural distinct languages and customs. desire to rise out of exploitation, and desire to rise out of oppression. Place-based planning is not colonially bound. In other words, boundaries of the land, legal boundaries, survey boundaries, demarcations are not the planning boundaries for Indigenous peoples. The rightful and legitimate claim to planning authority is another important place-based aspect. Knowledge, respected knowledge keepers, oral knowledge component, the importance of oral knowledge and traditions, Indigenous data collection methods, mainly observation, and collaboration and collective knowledge production. In terms of values and worldview, spiritual and physical connections to the land territory, environment, and resources, and worldviews and values links the community, the territory, and again, the importance of ancestors. Decisions that are made have to be grassrooted decision makers with a broader coalition building, consensus orientation, but with skilled and effective leadership, elder wisdom present, and future orientation with culture, with environmental and cultural protection. And finally, practices. So this would fall more into the implementation of a plan, leadership in implementation, elders as guardians, culturally appropriate actions, and parallel colonial rules and laws. And that's an important word, I think, in my presentation today, is this notion of parallel rules. So acknowledging rules of the state and rules of federal, provincial, and territorial governments, but also parallel meaning Indigenous being equally at the table and of equal importance and power, and to participate in Indigenous and colonial legal processes. So we have a responsible water sustainability path forward. What is that path forward? And I'm just about concluded here. What I'm wanting to do is put forward a water sustainability path forward, and that would be to commence regional planning immediately, to determine conservation targets, to assess land vulnerability, to incorporate Indigenous planning principles and practice, as I've outlaid them here. No new placer mining licenses pending outcome of a regional land use plan. No new placer mining licenses pending revised and rewritten mine permit processes that engage meaningfully and respectfully First Nations of the region and prioritizes water sustainability. Any future planning placer mining licenses to follow established law respecting free, prior, and informed consent with regional First Nations right holders. So there's work ahead, and I think the work ahead is an opportunity ahead to advance parallel planning, Western science married with and alongside traditional knowledge. In fact, Western science has so much to learn from Indigenous and traditional knowledge. So what is water? In my conclusion, a quote I often use from the Chiefs of Ontario: "There is no greater medicine than water. It is foundational, our very beginnings. It reminds us of where we came from, our first environment in the womb." Thank you. And I will end my last slide with using the metaphor, the sunrise or sunset metaphor. This is a pivotal moment in Yukon's future. And I think the future of Yukon's wetlands is now. And the question, will it be sunrise or sunset? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and board members. My name is Nuri Frame. I'm legal counsel with the First Nation of Na-Cho, and I'm going to make some concluding remarks and recommendations to the board today, and we'll try to leave a little bit of time for questions as well. I see we only have about 15 minutes left. I want to begin by acknowledging the comments from Chief Mervyn and from the elders and youth who spoke so passionately and so eloquently earlier today in ND's presentation, and I really would urge the board members to take seriously what they heard and to appreciate the message that I think was being sent by all of those presenters, and maybe most succinctly and most eloquently by Cole Patterson with his comment, protect the water, keep it clean, and ensure he's able to be on the land and go hunting with his grandfather and his father. I know that the board has, yes, sorry, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. We can see you and hear you.
Okay, great. And so again, I think that some of my initial comments have been cut off, but just to start, my name is Nuri Frame. I'm a lawyer with the law firm of Pape Salter Teye. I'm legal counsel to the First Nation of Na-Cho NND has asked me to make some concluding comments and some recommendations to the board to end our presentation today, and I'm honored to be here and to be able to do that. I see that we are running fairly short on time, so I will try to keep this brief, and I will try to ensure that the board does have some opportunity to ask questions at the end of our presentation. Obviously, as we heard from some other presenters previously, if there are questions that the board isn't able to ask today or that would like to ask after the presentation concludes, we're of course happy to answer any questions that might come to us in writing or in the context of closing remarks tomorrow. I'd like to acknowledge particularly the comments from Chief Mervyn and the comments from some of the elders and youth from the First Nation of Na-Cho who spoke earlier today. I would really urge the board to take seriously what they heard and to appreciate the gravity of the concerns and the importance of the interests that were being expressed by those community members. I think that Cole Patterson's sort of closing remarks, protect the land, protect the water, keep it clean, let him be on the land with his father and his grandfather hunting and harvesting, I think was really resonant and telling in its simplicity. So we appreciate and understand that the board has posed specific questions, and the board is asking for feedback from various parties in the context of this public interest hearing in order to help it guide future decision-making on project by project or application by application bases. But I think what you've heard earlier today from the First Nation of Na-Cho and previously from other presenters, I think most notably Nyak, is that these issues can't be divorced from their context. That wetlands must be understood and must be protected as part of a holistic, integrated whole, that they fit within ecosystems and can't be excised from them. And similarly, the rights and interests that are at play here from the perspective of the First Nation of Na-Cho also need to be understood holistically and contextually. And so please trust me when I say that we're not avoiding the questions. We're trying to answer the questions in the way that we think they need to be answered. And from our perspective, the analysis that the board is undertaking has to be undertaken fully mindful and with deep appreciation of the treaty relationship that the Indigenous peoples of the Yukon, and particularly in this case, the First Nation of Na-Cho has with their treaty partners and with their traditional territories. As some of our elders spoke to earlier today, the promise of the final agreements was a promise of co-management and co-governance, a promise that decisions about the health and well-being of the lands, of the waters, of the wildlife would be made jointly and would be made in a way which was fully aware of and fully mindful of the culture, the history, the rights, and the futures of Indigenous people in the Yukon. And we're deeply concerned that continuing to make projects authorizing placer mining in wetlands in the Yukon generally and in the First Nation of Na-Cho traditional territory specifically on a project by project or application by application basis really risks missing the forest for the trees. And I suspect that the board has recognized that. And I appreciate that by holding this hearing in the public interest, the board is allowing us to confront and consider these issues in a broader context and in a more holistic way. And we're really appreciative of the opportunity to do that. From the perspective of the First Nation of Na-Cho there are two principles that necessarily frame and support any question about if and when a project should be licensed. The first is, how does that decision fit within the treaty context, the treaty relationship? And second, is the decision being made in a precautionary way? And in our submission, it's necessary that every authorization be mindful of and take the full measure of the importance of the treaty relationship and of the spirit and intent of the final agreements, and that every decision be made with the intent of being as precautionary as possible, by which I mean recognizing not only the short-term or immediate interests, but also recognizing broader and more long-term interests, and being respectful of the fact that knowledge gaps need to be acknowledged, and that sometimes the right thing to do is to do nothing. And so we've heard a lot over the past few days about the commitments in Chapter 14 of the final agreements, and I think that those commitments are critical and essential as the board is doing its work. But we submit that it's equally important, if not more important, for the board to also take note of the commitments in Chapter 11 of the final agreement, the commitments with respect to land use planning and regional land use planning in particular. And I'd just like to point to a few of the objectives in Chapter 11 to again frame the context that we think the board must be cognizant of when discharging its responsibilities. Chapter 11 at 1.1.3 notes that the purpose of the chapter is to recognize and promote the cultural values of Yukon Indian people. It goes on to say that the purpose of the chapter includes to utilize the knowledge and experience of Yukon Indian people in order to achieve effective land use planning, and further, to ensure that social, cultural, economic, and environmental policies are applied to the management, protection, and use of land and water resources in an integrated and coordinated manner so as to ensure sustainable development. And those principles right now are not being honored in the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Cho. It's been 25 years since the final agreement came into effect, and despite the passage of a quarter century, there is no regional land use plan. In fact, no regional land use planning process has even started. Which means, and turning to the questions that the board has asked, which means that when considering what information should be required, none of that information is there with respect to the First Nation of Na-Cho traditional territory, because the work has not yet been done. The land use planning has not been undertaken. The traditional knowledge has not been gathered. The Western science work has not been done. And so in our view, to continue to authorize or permit placer mining in wetland areas, and quite frankly, mining of any kind, but that goes well beyond the scope of this hearing and this board's jurisdiction, but to permit placer mining in wetland areas in the absence of land use planning and in the absence of the knowledge collection that's necessary to inform good, sound, constitutionally valid, and precautionary decisions, then this board should take advantage of the authority that it has and decline to authorize any further placer mining in wetlands. And now I know we heard earlier today about the importance of the board's statutory role and some discussion about how broad or narrow it might be. And we also heard about principles of administrative law and administrative fairness. And certainly those principles matter. And certainly those statutory responsibilities matter. But in my submission, what matters a great deal more is not the statutory context, but the constitutional context. The board has to approach these decisions and understand the authorizations it's being asked to give, the licenses it's being asked to issue, as being made within the constitutional context of the treaty relationship. The board's activities are discussed at great length in Chapter 14, and in discharging its duty, the board, as with any public actor in Canada, must do so in a constitutional way, and that means being fully mindful and respectful of Aboriginal and treaty rights, which are entrenched in Section 35 of the Constitution of Canada. And as we all know, the First Nation final agreements themselves are entrenched as constitutionally protected documents. And so in the simplest terms, it is our submission that it is incumbent on the board to look not just to its statute and to look not just to the applications before it and the particular process, but to look also to the final agreements and to look to the Constitution of Canada and to recognize that right now, the current state of play in the Yukon and certainly the current state of play in the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Cho makes it essentially impossible for the board to issue authorizations for placer mining in wetlands in a way that's consistent with the Constitution and consistent with both the letter and also the spirit and intent of the First Nation of Na-Cho final agreement. And so again, I'd like to echo the recommendation made by our friends at TH yesterday and ask the board not to issue any licenses. And again, to use Chief Mervin's language, to take a pause. We're not asking for a perpetual halt. We're asking for a pause on authorizations that will cause fundamental and irreparable damage to the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Cho and the rights and interests of the citizens of the First Nation of Na-Cho, not just now, but in future generations, to pause making decisions with those kinds of impacts until the treaty obligations have been fulfilled and until the knowledge and information necessary to make those decisions effectively, responsibly, and in a precautionary way are available. Members of the board, I obviously have a number of things further to say, but I notice there's only about 2.5 minutes left in our time, and I would like to give the board members an opportunity to ask any questions, or at least a couple of questions that they might have without blowing the schedule entirely. And as I said, we are happy to return to this further tomorrow in our closing comments and in our written submissions and to respond to written questions. So maybe I'll wrap up there with 2 minutes and change to spare and invite any questions that the board might have, either for me or for the other members of the First Nation of Na-Cho presentation team.
Thank you, Mr. Frame, and thanks very much to to Chief Mervin and the elders, many of whom I know, which also dates me, and to the youth and community members who took the time and trouble to make a very comprehensive presentation today. Thanks to the consultants and others who've contributed. We do have a few minutes, and I would just remind everyone that we will probably be coming back with some considered questions later, and give people an opportunity to respond if they so wish in writing to specific lines of inquiry that we might have. But if there's any, are there any specific questions right now? We have a couple of minutes. I'd open it to the to board members to ask them. Mr. Wormsby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the elders and citizens and youth who gave some strong points. It was good to hear that. But I'd like to ask a quick question, and you know, recognizing is would it be possible to look at some of these principles of Indigenous planning if there is if the board ultimately decides that we have to proceed, that due to statutory limitations or whatever conditions are on the board, to continue to license individual projects absent the regional land use plan? Thanks.
Sure, and I'm happy to make a couple of comments on that and to open it up to any members of the NND Lands Department who might also want to weigh in. I think we recognize that the board is to some extent between a rock and a hard place. And we recognize that the absence of regional land use planning is certainly not a situation of the board's making. And we recognize that decisions made by public government in the 25 years since the final agreement came into effect are not decisions that were made by this board, and that the board needs to deal with the world as it finds it, and it needs to find a way to do its job in that context. So I guess it's really, from my perspective, a double-barreled analysis. The first is what I was speaking about previously, which is that in every instance, currently, it is our view that the board should be taking a pause. But if a pause is not possible in the context of a particular application for reasons of statutes of limitations or other pressures, I think there's been a lot of good insights that we've heard today, and I direct the board to the summary of recommendations at the conclusion of the Lands Department's presentation for the kinds of precautionary or mitigation tools that could be implemented if a decision has to be made to allow a license to go forward, again, notwithstanding our view that shouldn't be happening in the absence of those underlying treaty obligations being fulfilled.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Any other quick questions? Well, thanks everyone again for their participation this afternoon. We much appreciate the presentation and the insights that you've provided. We will, from here, we may come back with some questions, and we will let you know shortly. The time is now quarter to 4, so we'll reconvene at 4 o'clock. And sorry?
Chief Mervyn had a comment that he wanted to make, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Please proceed, Mr. Chief Mervyn.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Well, I know that Mary did a good presentation in our behalf, but we are continually perplexed and confused and frustrated in the fact that the board has the wherewithal to give the final decision to any operations in regards to the water license. But the fact still remains that we are proceeding in the mining issues without regards to the fact that the Placer Mining Act and the Courts Mining Act is not in compliance with our agreements. It's continually frustrating to see, and we know these issues, but we're continually being drawn to the fact that we may have to take this step further on our behalf in regards to future creating a future sovereignty in our own land. So, it's just a comment, but I know, like Neri said, that the water board is caught between a rock and a hard place. We totally acknowledge that. Because over the past 25 years, after a succession of many different levels of government, different mindsets, and here we are, still in the same place, with our land being disrupted, and our wetlands being devastated. I use that word loosely because I know that there's one example right here in town of the wetlands being altered, topsoil being taken off our lands where we live up on the bench here and placed down in the wetlands, which we know is a community source of water. So, but that's another issue. But it's just so frustrating to us, and we know. I take myself back to 60, 70 years. I'm an old man now. When the old timers used to tell us, "Why are you building there? There's permafrost there." I used to fish grayling right along in the two streams that run right through the middle of the town. So that was wetlands servicing this delta from Big Island. But the assumption of the community here is that it's insignificant, but to us, it means a lot. Because altering the natural flow of the wetlands itself, the contaminants are going into our drinking water. So are we being told the truth about the cleanliness of the water? So it's just a comment from our nation that, we have huge issues in regards to the presentation that was made today by our elders and our youth, and The concern is clear. And we need to, again, you know, I know that the water board is in a tough position, but we need land use planning, which will fix all these issues. We need it desperately. Okay, just a comment. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Na-Cho.
Thank you very much, Chief Mervyn, for those final comments, summary comments. We will certainly be taking all the comments made take great care in weighing them, and thank you for the insights. Much appreciated. We will resume at 5 minutes past 4. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for returning and allowing us to move on to our next and the final presentation for the day. So I would ask the Chamber of Mines to take over and provide their thoughts and presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. It's Randy Clarkson here. I'll hopefully bring up my slideshow here. I don't know, can you see it on the screen here?
We can indeed, Mr. Clarkson.
Okay, it's Randy Clarkson on behalf of the Yukon Chamber of Mines. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation. I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to go through it very quickly. I had asked for 3 hours, but we're down to 50 minutes, and I've tried to limit the slides, but I felt I needed to do a minimal presentation. The slides are fairly self-explanatory, and you can read them as probably more quickly than I could possibly read them out loud. I'd like to bring your attention to the photograph here on this right side. It's a view of the Indian River Valley downstream of Quartz Creek. It was mined in 1993, and it has recovered without any intentional reclamation measures. All this passive wetland reclamation. You'll notice lots of gray areas of gravel on it. That's because this area was mined before the introduction of mining land use, and miners were not required until 1998 to reclaim the landscape. Most of you know me, probably some in not such a good light, but that's fine. I'm a professional mining engineer. I've been actually in the territory since 1974, in Whitehorse since 1980. I've worked with a number of organizations. I have a good background in hydrology because I have a small hydro plant and did quite a bit of stream reconnaissance and peak flow measurements. I've worked with all kinds of organizations, industry, as well as Canadian International Development Agency on environmental regulatory issues, as well as gold recovery, mining, and reclamation. I'm the co-author of the Wetland Best Management Practice that the KPMA put together in 2015. And I've lived beside a marsh in Shalawada wetland for 35 years, and we enjoy a view of it every day, every meal outside of our home. I'd like to acknowledge Anne Michon. She worked with me for 2 years in 2014 and 15 and did a very thorough review of bird species and their densities and diversities in mined and unmined areas of the Yukon River. She was initially hired by Stuart Schmidt to document the passive reclamation of post-mined areas in the Indian River Valley. You can see she's worked on several continents. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to placer mining and its constraints. I'd like to thank the earlier speakers for doing a lot of that work for me, and the objectives of wetland reclamation, some practical steps required for wetland reclamations, and what I think are required changes. Up on the upper right is a picture of panel mining in Henderson Creek. It's one of the more efficient methods of mining. The previous pit is used as a tailings pond, and the overburden is piled nearby, so it makes reclamation very quick. On the lower left is a picture of a recontoured and regrowing Lower Hunker Creek. And on the lower right is a very young Mike McDougall and a very young Sarah McDougall on a reclaimed, passively reclaimed settling pond in the 60 Mile area. I just put this summary up in case I don't get through everything, but the objective of wetland reclamation should be to reestablish the appropriate saturation and or flooded conditions, soils and topography to facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining wetland habitat. This is not my definition, it's come from the research, but I think it's quite fitting. I hope I can show you that the information to support a water license application should be conceptual in nature, because miners need to be able to adapt to suit unforeseen or changing conditions. The application should include areas with pre-existing wetlands, and approximately what proportion of these will be affected. In terms of thresholds, I think you have to look in a regional context, and I've just put out 10% here. I mean, that's a number we'll have to sort out on our own, but the natural wetlands in each application should be required to leave some portion of its original wetlands undisturbed. I read over the Palmer Group information guidelines, which the Water Board appears to have adopted, at least tentatively. And depending how they're implemented, they could be extremely costly to implement and could result in a dramatic shrinkage of the placer mining industry, with little of any benefits to anyone except wetland consultants and hydrological consultants. I think we should reject these in favor of a much simpler and more cost-effective approach, which actually enhances wetland reclamation on the ground, and the modified best management practices developed by the KPMA in 2015. I think we need to get together, examine these best management practices, modify them, try and explain them, get people's input, and they should become a standard boilerplate conditions in any Class 4 land use permit. They would be easy to enforce, easy to understand, and would greatly accelerate and improve some of the pictures you saw by earlier presenters of areas of mining which have not been reclaimed properly. Then we need to train the miners and the mines inspectors so that they can not only carry out the reclamation, but enforce these permit conditions. We've been mining for more than 135 years. Most of you are probably aware of the history of the Yukon mining industry. The Klondike Gold Rush is very famous. The production in the 1900s was bankrolled the Dominion of Canada. That's how big it was. We've had virtually continuous production. There's over 150 operations. And gold production from 1898 was worth over 35 billion at today's prices, and that's because of the high price of gold as well as the number of ounces. You can see some old timers mining on the upper right, and on the lower right you'll see an operation, a very large scale operation in the 60 Mile River. Alan Fry was the late executive director of the Klondike Placer Mining Association, and he coined the term family farm of the north. He was also the executive director of the Caribou Cattlemen's Association, and he's found very many similarities, the amount of local ownership and operation, and the fact that the placer miners are committed to the long term. It's either the second or third largest industry, depending on the status of the tourism industry. Right now with COVID, it's quite an important financial input into especially the communities such as Dawson and Mayo. There's some inherent constraints in placer mining, and I don't think people understand that. They're not anything like a metal mine deposit, and it's very difficult to develop accurate ore reserve estimates. And these accurate ore reserve estimates, defined under National Instrument 43-101, are required if you want the possibility of financing with publicly traded companies. So that option, and quite often to outline these potential areas to this standard of certainty, would be more expensive than mining it. So that pretty well eliminates public companies and the deep pockets of public companies from placer mining. And this erratic nature of the deposit means the miners have to be flexible. They have to be able to change their conceptual mining plan and adapt to changing or unexpected conditions. So I always cringe when the Water Board or some other regulator asks for for a very detailed mining plan because it's virtually impossible to do. You need to be able to have the flexibility to respond to changes in unanticipated conditions. This is why all the Yukon placer mines are relatively small. They're privately financed, family-owned and operated ventures. They don't, and in spite of these limited finances, they have to buy this large-scale heavy equipment, and it's very expensive. Excavators and bulldozers often well over $1 million. So they end up having large loans from partners and relatives and banks and equipment vendors, and they need to make regular payments. So they don't really have any choice. They're in it for the long term because they have to operate through low gold price periods. They have to operate every year in order to keep their employees and pay down their debts. And they simply don't have the access to the financial resources that public mining companies do, and they can't afford lengthy or expensive environmental studies. I'm going to show you some brief examples of Yukon placer deposits. Jeff Bond did an excellent job of this, so I won't waste too much time on it. There's two photos here of placer mining in the Indian River Valley. The upper one is near Ruby Creek, where the black muck is quite thin, as you can see the vegetation and then the black muck and then the gravels. And the other one is closer to Quartz Creek, where it's a little deeper. But the activities are always the same. They involve stripping and thawing the ground and accessing the pay gravels and washing them with water and gravity only in a sluice box. Unfortunately, wetland avoidance strategies found in other industries are impossible in some cases with placer mining when the pay gravels are located directly below the wetlands. This is the shallow bulldozer pit on the Indian River, and you can see the mounds of overburden and the water already starting to collect in ponds. And I want you to take a good look at this picture. It looks quite ugly right now, but as time goes on, and the greening occurs and the reclamation occurs, it looks much better. Wetlands are very important ecosystems. Most of the rest of the world has permanently altered or destroyed most of their wetlands, and farming is the greatest converter of wetlands, and it's a permanent loss of wetlands. We also have examples of that in Whitehorse, so Walmart and the Save-On Foods. But the Yukon is relatively undeveloped in that respect, and we have vast areas of wetlands. And the good part about mining is that these impacts can be temporary, and we can reclaim back to very good and very productive wetlands. These two pictures on the right are waterfowl in passively reclaimed wetland ponds. There's a vast extent of Canada's wetlands. It goes all the way from Newfoundland to northwestern Yukon Territory. They're most commonly bogs and fens with minor amounts of swamps. As Ducks alluded to earlier, marshes and shallow water wetlands are quite rare. Jeff Bond did some work and he went over it yesterday morning, so I won't spend too much time on it. But he did show that the Indian River wetland basin here is quite small in relation to other wetland complexes in both the traditional territory of the Klondike-Wichin and in the Klondike Plateau. For instance, he shows the Indian River wetlands 60 square kilometers versus many others of much larger sizes. And he also indicates the total disturbance is only of the Indian River basin is only 0.29%, which is quite low. This is some work he did with the satellite mapping of wetlands in the Klondike Plateau. And again, you can see that the Indian River, which is quite small in terms of wetland area in the regional context, is very important to gold miners. It's one of the largest gold deposits and produces about 50% of the gold, alluvial gold in the Yukon. And again, it has a very low total land disturbance of 0.27%, according to Mr. Bond. The board, one of the questions was, what would the wetland reclamation objectives be? It was your third question, but I think objectives should be the first question. So I've tried to answer it here. And again, this definition doesn't come from my words, it comes from the research, but it's to reestablish appropriate saturated or flooded conditions, soils, and topography. And you want to facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining wetland habitat. Self-sustaining is really important here. We don't want to be coming back and having to alter and play with it many years in the future. And we think it should include a varied landscape, not only with several ponds, lakes, and wetlands, but interconnected drainage systems with little vegetated uplands. It's also most beneficial if the habitat has culturally important species such as waterfowl, moose, and beaver for all hunters and trappers. Sorry, I went the wrong way there. Wetland reclamation science is a new and evolving science. We have very limited information regarding northern wetlands. We have deep winter ice and permafrost areas. Most of our wetlands aren't mapped. We have a lack of previous experience with reclamation other than passive reclamation. And permafrost creates localized and perched water tables. In my pond, for example, beside my house, we often get over 2 meters of ice. It freezes right to the bottom and pulls up the weeds in the spring. Most of the relevant research that we were able to access came from northern Alberta, where even the largest companies reclaim peatland, bogs, and fens into marsh and shallow water wetlands. Again, there's 2 pictures of waterfowl in passively reclaimed areas on the Indian River Valley. And in my investigations of previous post-mined areas on the Indian River prove it's possible to reclaim many wetlands to productive and diverse marshes and shallow water wetlands. And these host many endangered and threatened species. And I agree with both CPAWS and Conservation Society that bogs and fens are extremely difficult or impossible to replicate in a reasonable time frame. As I mentioned here, even large public companies have trouble and very difficult time reclaiming bog and fen wetlands back into peatlands, and they end up reclaiming them into marsh and shallow water wetlands. Fortunately, we have great examples of the very successful unaided or passive reclamation of placer mine sites in the Indian River Valley. Placer miners have been mining in the Indian River Valley for over 40 years and over 100 years in other areas. And all this time, the wetlands have been passively reclaiming themselves. We don't think it's necessary to do extensive amounts of baseline studies, stream flow, and ground flow measurements to predict how mined areas will reclaim. We can see many examples in the field. They're waiting for you. We drive by them every day. However, we can enhance passive reclamation so that it occurs more rapidly and into better wildlife habitat. Wetland systems are complex, but reclamation of them into marsh and shallow water wetlands is actually very straightforward. Here's an aerial view of the Indian River upstream of Quartz, taken from Stuart's airplane with the door off and me hanging halfway out with the camera. But we had quite an interesting time. One thing you'll notice here too is that this area has had probably 20 years to reclaim, and you'll see that the disturbed areas butt right up against the pre-existing peatland wetlands in this area. And this is verified by Karen McKenna's maps. You can see that all her mapped wetlands, the purple is the swamps and the green is the fens. They butt right up against disturbed areas. So what you're seeing is that certainly if we'd never done any mining in wetlands before in the Indian River Valley, we might consider doing a lot of studies to try and predict what would happen. But we really don't have to try to predict what would happen. It's out there. We just have to go out and look at it. If you have any questions about, well, what the effects will be, you can go out and take a look on your own. It's very expensive and frustrating to try and reclaim peatland wetlands back to their original condition. And there's a high likelihood of failure. In some cases, I was asked to prepare reclamation plans on this basis, and I knew that they would end up being dryland habitat. So it wasn't an easy call. You can easily reclaim these areas from marsh and shallow water wetland complex, and they have the most significant wildlife diversity. And that's not my words, that's the National Wetlands Working Group. And any proposed wetland reclamation techniques need to consider the various limitations, such as the lack of local experience with anything but passive reclamation, the difficulty to predict the success of different types of reclamation, and the limited financial and technical resources of these miners. This is some pictures from the web, actually, of moose in shallow water habitat is very important to moose in terms of their minerals and protection from predators as well as insects. This is my most famous example of passive accidental or accidental wetland reclamation. This has all occurred without any land use reclamation requirements. If they had had land use reclamation requirements, we wouldn't have found this out. They would have all been filled and probably reclaimed as dry land instead of as marsh and shallow water wetlands. One of the things that I keep running into in this area is that the application of characteristics and functions and benefits of wetlands that are based on southern wetlands and not on northern wetlands. And in particular, there are many similarities, but there are some very differences. I believe Dr. Cherry Westbrook said that even the same class of wetland can perform quite differently in a different area, depending on the physiography and the hydrology and so on. You can see here that they do provide carbon storage, but our wetlands are much thinner than the ones in the south. They do provide regulation of water flows on a daily and seasonal basis. Different wetlands have different abilities to do that. And one thing they do, which most people don't probably realize, is that they do produce methane, and they are considered to be one of the largest contributors to climate change. And the reason being that methane has 80 times the reflectivity in the atmosphere that carbon dioxide does. There's a little diagram here that shows you how methane is produced by microbes. Basically, anytime vegetation decomposes underwater in the absence of oxygen, it tends to produce methane. The US Geological Survey in 2016, they looked at the Alaskan wetlands during the historical period, and they found that wetlands were net generators of carbon dioxide equivalents, and they were expected to increase quite dramatically over the next 80 years. In contrast, upland forests were a net carbon sink, and they were projected to increase as a retainer of carbon over the next 80 years, despite the risk of increased forest fires. Water flow moderation of wetlands. Permafrost restricts the flow of water and confines water to the thin surface active layer. And what you'll see if you examine the hydrology records of the Yukon streams, the Indian River, the 60-mile river, and some of the northern rivers, is that there are actually periods in the winter, in March and February, where there's no measurable flow. Some fairly large rivers go right down to nothing. And it's because the permafrost prevents the surface water from getting into a groundwater aquifer and discharging throughout the winter months. And what we find is that many of these areas have very high reactions to summer events, very high reactions to spring freshet, and very low winter flows. And post-placer mined areas where the gravels are thawed, they can provide year-round groundwater storage and flow regulation, which is not commonly found in permafrost areas. And this is backed up by the measurements that I did looking for small hydro streams. When I was in the Whitehorse area, I would measure small hydro streams with wetlands on them, and they were great. They had hardly any surges with storm events, and they had solid winter flows. When I went in the Dawson areas and did the same flow measurements, I was quite surprised to find out how erratic the streams were. This is a comparison I did for an information request last year. And it was just a comparison of the Little South Klondike River and the Indian River. And it looks fairly complex. Engineers like complex graphs, but what it shows is that the Indian River has almost no flow in February and March, whereas the Little South Klondike has quite a bit more flow. And the Indian River has a much higher reaction to spring freshet and storm events until the summer, when the active layer starts to play a part, and there's more flow regulation by the wetlands. Now, all classes of wetlands provide some stabilization of flows, some stabilization, filtering and purification of water, and they all store carbon. Even the little marsh outside my house is full of partially decomposed vegetation. It's only about a foot of the 7 feet of depth that is water. The rest is decomposed vegetation. We found in our research in the Indian River Valley that many songbirds and waterfowl were common to both the undisturbed and the mined areas, and that all habitats hosted species of concern. EDI did a follow-up study on Ann's data and found that the Indian River marsh and shallow water wetlands actually had more species of concern and gave it a higher ecological index than the originals in the original area. You'll see many other species in there, moose, caribou, foxes, because there's both wetland and upland habitats. Some other research conducted by Environmental Dynamics, EDI, in 2013 for yes indicated a very high density of moose and other wildlife species in post-mined areas in spite of increased hunting pressure and in spite of better access. And many species and insects are completely dependent on open water wetlands for habitat survival. I'm going to try and get through this on time here. I think the difference between reclamation and restoration was pointed out by previous speakers. What the intent of the best management practices the KPMA originally developed was reclamation and not restoration, trying to return a site disturbed by mining to a condition where it would be able to reestablish a suitable productive environment. This picture is an example of Lower Dominion Creek. This is upland revegetation where the area has been smoothed and contoured and black muck spread back over it. It's less than a year old. Some wetlands form spontaneously with no intentional reclamation, but with minor topographic and reclamation features added during the post-mining landscape, you can enhance it much more. You can make it return much more quickly and a much better habitat for waterfowl and beavers and moose and so on. Again, this photograph shows gray areas of gravel, which are there because there was no mining land use requirements in 1993, not till 1998. Here's a picture of from one of the literature of the typical type of reclaimed wetlands showing marsh and shallow open water. Here's another picture of the Indian River of a passively reclaimed marsh and shallow water wetland. Now I want to go into an overview of the best management practices that the Klondike Placer Mining Association developed, and there seems to be a reaction to BMPs, and we can call them permit conditions or standard mitigative measures, whatever you want to do. It's not a problem. What we wanted to do with this is we wanted to enhance the passive reclamation because we knew the passive reclamation was already operating, but we wanted to try and improve on it. But in the process of coming up with some guidelines, we realized that we needed to be able to adapt quickly to changing pay gravel, site conditions, and economics for placer miners. And that's why we went with the best management practices approach. And we want to use and adapt the existing post-mining landscape like pits and settling ponds and hills as much as possible because it reduces costs, it reduces the amount of diesel you have to burn to move materials around. And it results in marsh and shallow water wetlands, which are actually quite uncommon normally. The post-mined areas normally have between 20 to 25% open water versus the unmined areas, which have between 4 and 5% of open water areas. This photograph is another passively reclaimed area about 10 to 15 years old in the Indian River Valley. Most of my experience, I've worked for over 35 years in the Indian River Valley, comes from there. So as I mentioned, placer deposits are erratic, difficult to predict. It's extremely difficult to estimate ore reserves for placer deposits. So you need to be flexible and adapt rapidly to changing conditions. That's why we went with best management practices or standard mitigative measures. These BMPs will allow the reestablish the appropriate saturation and flooded conditions, soils and topography to facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining wetland, which is our objective. The first BMP in any case is avoid disturbing wetlands where practical. That's often not the case, not possible for placer mining if the pay gravels are directly underneath. But you can avoid building roads, camps, and other infrastructure on wetlands. And if you do, you'll save yourself a lot of grief It's no fun building roads, camps, and other infrastructure on wetlands. They're very difficult and expensive to do. And you need to protect some of the remaining wetlands that are located over uneconomic areas so they act as a source of vegetation and animals for the disturbed areas that you're reclaiming. The second rule of wetland reclamation is keeping wetlands wet. That probably sounds obvious to you now. This little diagram shows different ways that wetlands take in and discharge water. The most reliably saturated or wetted ground will occur in low areas near or below the groundwater table. So if you have an open pit and it's got 2 meters of water in the bottom, you really don't want to fill it back up. You've already started to create a perfect physiography for reclamation to a shallow water wetland. Variations in the water level are normal. You'll see that some waterfowl habitat is enhanced when the water levels vary. This is another picture about 5 years old of unaided passive wetland reclamation. In a few cases, you may find some former wetland areas may not hold water and the moisture in spite of the use of these best management practices, and they'll end up being reclaimed as drylands. But that's okay, because we can reclaim many dryland areas into wetlands as well. This is part of the existing mining land use regulations. Some of the best management practices are the same. You need to stockpile organics for later use. You need to put them close to where you're going to use them. You need to protect them from erosion. You need to use your old pits for settling ponds whenever possible. That helps to seal them up so they hold water and make a much better shallow water wetlands. You don't want to refill or cap them unless there's a risk of erosion. And what I've found is that old settling ponds near or below the water table often reclaim rapidly and with very little trouble into marsh and shallow water wetlands. These again are passively reclaimed areas in the Indian River wetlands, one with the moose and the other with the kindergarten of Canada geese. You need to grade and recontour the post-mined areas. This is a part of the existing land use regulations. We want to see a wide range of topographic features in the landscape, including small hills, small depressions, and undulating topography. That creates great habitat. Shallow depressions can be excavated if you were silly enough to backfill your pit or if you don't have a depression in that area. The creation of excellent wildlife habitat by digging a hole and filling the water is quite a common practice all over the world. When we were in South Africa in the game farms, we often saw man-made dug pits filled with water, and they provide a focus for all kinds of wildlife. Basically, you dig a hole and fill it with water, and the wildlife shows up, and it creates a very diverse and highly productive habitat. This is another requirement of the existing mining land use regulations, so I won't go into that. You need to roughen the disturbed surfaces so that they provide microsites for germs and moisture to collect. Don't backfill your shallow open pits. That's often a problem with the water board secretariat. Sometimes I have to explain to them that we're not going to backfill the shallow pits because we're going to turn them into shallow water wetlands. If they're anywhere from 1 foot to 7 feet in depth, you don't want to backfill them. Yeah, you need to seal off the pit bottoms if necessary by lining with fine soils. And you may need to block drainage ditches if required. Some of the literature will show you having dams and levees and gates you open and close, but we try to avoid this because it requires long-term maintenance. And here's another example of a passive wetland formed without any intentional land or wetland reclamation measures. Again, the gray areas are areas that weren't covered properly with fines because it wasn't part of the rules at that time. And you can see how closely the reclaimed areas butt right up against the natural swamps and fens in the area. There doesn't seem to be a huge impact in most cases. When you do backfill deep mine pits is when they're more than 2 meters deep. 2 meters is kind of the range of depth of most diving ducks, so that's why we look at a 2 meter maximum depth for a shallow water wetland. If you plan to backfill the mine pits, you want to have the overburden close by where you can easily push it back in. In-pit lakes are used where you have a deep pit and you don't have any material nearby. You may have worked your way up the valley, and the first material you excavated from your first pit is quite a ways away and it's already reclaimed, and you don't want to destroy that. So what you do to compensate for the deep lake is to put these shallow shorelines around the edges. They call them littoral zones. They provide shallow nutrient-rich areas on the perimeters of the lakes where plants can grow, fish and waterfowl can find refuge and habitat. And you can do that fairly easily by cutting back the final pit walls or pushing overburden over the edges of the pond to create gentle slopes. I've done a lot of that in the Atlan area and Otter Creek because the pits there are 120 feet deep and very hard to backfill. There's an example on the bottom there of a passive lake and marsh wetland in the Indian River Valley. Marshes often occur around the perimeter of lakes and shallow water wetlands. Very common. Here's a schematic showing the deeper excavations. You can make the shorelines irregular, put peninsulas in there and islands and so on. This all helps create better habitat. You need to use existing post-mine pits and depressions. You see some of the speakers will talk about the high costs of doing reclamation and creating marsh and shallow water wetlands, and that's because people like the oil companies, they have to dig these holes, they have to create these hills, whereas they're already part of the mining landscape. The shallow water wetlands used to be open pits. The hills used to be overburden piles, and with very few modifications, we can turn them into very productive habitat very quickly. These again are more examples of naturally reclaimed or passively reclaimed shallow water and marsh wetlands. The other thing you want to do is size and shape the pond. Engineers like me like big square pits, but you can make them quite irregular by pushing material in from the side or excavating material from the side. The more irregular the shape of the pond is, the better habitat it is for most species, including waterfowl. Again, you can see boulder piles and gravel piles which weren't covered because of the absence of land use regulations, which now exist. You need to construct the ponds with irregular bottoms, and that's dead easy with placer mining because all the ponds, the pits are already very irregular. That's just the nature of the geology. Here's some shorebirds at a passively reclaimed pond on the Indian River Valley. This is a schematic showing how to create the best shoreline conditions on these marsh and shallow water wetlands. On the extreme left, you can see how if you have a steep bank, you can cut it back with the excavator or backfill into the side of it. You need to coat it in topsoil and make sure that you've got in the neighborhood of 2 meters of water in it. It's good to have some gravels along the shorelines for shorebirds, but otherwise you try and eliminate the amount of gravels we see. You can see the places where the emergent, the floating, and the submerged vegetation tends to grow. And in concert with that, you have upland vegetation as well. Uplands and marsh and shallow water wetlands make a very good combination of diverse and highly productive habitat. Even though we've seen a lot of gravels in the previous slides from other people and in my previous slides, you do need a couple of gravel piles here. They provide nesting habitat for common nighthawk. I don't know if you want to tell the placer miners too much about that because we really want to try and limit the amount of exposed gravel, but the odd gravel pile is a good thing. You need to connect the ponds provided DFO is okay with that. It's not going to interfere with salmon rearing or spawning or anything. Connecting the ponds tends to facilitate the exchange and movement of aquatic animals and plants. And it's good to surround these ponds with hills. It provides privacy. You'll see more pairs of mating couples of waterfowl will be in a given hectare of water if there's some privacy there, if the ponds are split up. And if you have a large pond, you'll tend to have fewer per square hectare of water than you will with smaller ponds or irregular ponds. So woody debris is always great. You can add it. It makes great habitat as well. They recommend against adding fish, although they'll often come in on their own. In the Indian River, there's a lot of the ponds and the slow areas in the river now are full of pike and grayling. Very, very good fishing down there. What the fish do is they eat some of the insects that the waterfowl would otherwise eat, and they do slow down the progression of the marsh and shallow water wetlands slightly. You need to revegetate disturbed areas if required. That's usually not a big deal in the Indian River Valley because there's so much black muck and the water table is so high that it reclaims very quickly without any fertilizing or forced reseeding. Where you don't have these kind of great conditions, then you got to look at appropriate seeds and or fertilizer. Beavers inevitably invade your reclaimed landscape. They will enlarge and deepen existing wetlands. They will change the shape of the wetlands. Muskrats can tunnel through and drain parts of the wetlands. They're all natural processes, and I wouldn't worry about them. Once you've created the wetland and it's basically been reclaimed, all these natural processes will come into play. There are some more examples. The previous one included of passively reclaimed wetlands in the Indian River Valley. Here was a muskrat and a beaver. You need to monitor the progress of reclamation. Many of the speakers have talked about that. It takes 10 to 15 years, even with these enhancements, to get a wetland well underway. You don't want to have long-term maintenance required. You want to monitor to see if adjustments need to be made to these best management practices or standard mitigative measures. The monitoring information should be used to gauge reclamation success. You don't want to go back in and tear up previously reclaimed areas and try and re-reclaim them, but you can apply those lessons to adjusting the best management practices and making them even more successful. I'm just going to emphasize that bottom point. Monitoring should be conducted by mines inspectors to ensure that the erosion has been limited. Revegetation of disturbed areas has occurred, both upland and wetland, and the reclaimed wetlands are saturated and underwater. There's a table here that Anne and I made up, which shows some of the things that can go wrong with trying to enhance natural restoration, and some of the indicators as well as some of the adaptive management strategies. I don't think I have time to go through that, so I'm going to brush over it, but it's certainly here if you want to take a look at this slide again. This is the area I showed you earlier on Ruby Creek. It reclaims back to the same type of passive reclamation as this, but we need to speed that up. I'm going to skip the wetland information guidelines. I'll come back to that if I can squeeze it in here. I want to get straight to the conclusions. Most Yukon placer mines have wetlands on their claims. I think over 70% do that. The exception are those working in heavily disturbed historic areas like Hunker Creek or Bonanza Creek or on the high bench White Channel deposits. So almost 3/4 of Yukon placer mines have wetlands on their claims. So anything you do about wetlands or any increased regulations on wetlands affects the vast majority of the Yukon placer mining industry. We've been mining the wetlands for over 100 years. It's not a new and novel thing. We can see the effects. We drive by them every day. We can see that in many cases, in most cases, the adjacent wetlands are still there. They're still functioning. A very small fraction of the percentage of the land surface of the entire plateau has been disturbed, not only by placer mining, but by roads and various other man-made infrastructure. There's ample existing evidence that the placer mined peatland wetlands are already passively reclaiming themselves, generally with little or no impact on adjacent undisturbed wetlands. The passively reclaimed areas have been found to have a higher density of wildlife, including endangered and threatened species, many types of waterfowl, moose, beavers, muskrats, various varieties of fish, and so on. And this is substantiated by the National Wildlife Working Group. We have the ability to enhance passive natural reclamation to speed up this process and provide superior wetlands using standardized permit conditions based on the best management practices. And this is what the Chamber of Mines is recommending. It's only possible to reclaim the original wetlands to a mixture of low hills, marsh, and shallow water wetlands, regardless of the type of original wetland that's disturbed. I often get the question, well, what do you do for bogs? What do you do for fens? What do you do for swamps? The reclamation procedure is virtually the same, and the end result is the same. It's low hills, marsh, and shallow water wetlands. Here's a comment on the Palmer Group's wetland information guidelines. As the KPMA found out, the Chamber of Mines found out there was a lot of duplication of the existing requirements. And depending on how they were interpreted, since some are a little bit vague, they could be extremely costly attempts to determine the extent of permafrost and surface and groundwater levels in existing wetlands. The field methods are subject to errors, and many wetland areas have no viable access prior to disturbance. If you've ever tried to stake a claim in a swamp area, you can't even land a helicopter in there. Placer miners don't have the financial or technical resources of public mining companies. They have much lower potential to emit acid or metal leachate compared to hard rock mines, and they can't afford the costs and delays inherent in the Palmer Group's wetland information guidelines. The KPMA provided some guidance on the cost up to $160,000 for larger operations in the wetlands. This is way more money than miners can afford, and it would eliminate the smaller miners from the industry and stop people from starting in the industry. You really don't have too many options as regulators. As the water board, you can either allow miners to convert peatlands into reclaimed marsh and shallow water wetlands, or dramatically reduce the placer mining industry. And the placer mining industry is the most robust industry. It's been going on here since the gold rush. It's gone through depressions and slowdowns, and it still is pumping out gold and is an important part of the economy. Placer miners are not universally enhancing wetland reclamation because regulators, assessors, and advisors, that's us, have not been able to agree or endorse a set of permit conditions or best management practices to achieve these goals. We need simple, affordable, effective, and easily understood, and most importantly, easily enforceable guidelines for the placer mining industry. Now, we can modify the best management practices. I think it'd be great to sit down and go over them, and I'm sure there's areas of improvement and changes that we could do, and we could create an affordable conceptual boilerplate type for all type 4 class 4 land use permits. The objective of wetland reclamation should be to reestablish the appropriate saturation or flooded conditions, soils, and topography to facilitate the natural development of a self-sustaining habitat. Information required in a water license should be conceptual in nature and should include mining and reclamation plans, which can be adapted to suit unforeseen or changing conditions. The application should contain the areas which have pre-existing wetlands and approximately what proportion of these wetlands will be disturbed and reclaimed into a mixture of low hills, marsh, and shallow water wetlands. Wetland conservation, development, and utilization thresholds in particular should be considered on a regional scale. Wetland guidelines developed by the Palmer Group could be extremely costly to implement and could result in a dramatic shrinkage of the placer industry with little, if any, benefits to anyone except to wetland consultants and hydrological consultants. These guidelines should be rejected or modified by the board in favor of simpler, cost-effective approach that are easier to enforce and actually will enhance wetland reclamation. You can imagine an inspector landing on a mine site and he's got an encyclopedia of rules and regulations to enforce on this particular site. It's much easier if he arrives on a site and he has 10 or 12 permit conditions, and he can say, I see that pit there, Frank, you were finished with it. How come it doesn't have sloped sides? How come it doesn't have topsoil over top of it? How come there's bare gravel sticking out? And he can quickly and easily assess whether or not this miner is in compliance and get him into compliance. I think that the Yukon government, First Nations, and the industry need to get together to review and amend and sanction a revised section of these best management practices. And they need to become part of the conditions of any class 4 land use permit. And I think the longer we delay and we fight over it, the less chance we have and the less opportunities we're taking advantage of to reclaim placer mined wetlands nicely. We could do a great job if we apply these best management practices, but as long as we argue and talk about it, we're not going to get there. Seem to be having trouble coming down. Here we go. Recommendations 2. And you do this by training. We need to train both the miners and the mines inspectors regarding wetland reclamation and the use and enforcement of these new license conditions. As I said, wetlands are complex systems, but nature is already passively reclaiming them. We know we can reclaim them. We know we can enhance what nature is already doing. We can do it without requiring long-term maintenance and management. We need to do monitoring. We need to be able to adjust these best management practices or standard rules, land use condition rules, so that we do better in the future. And I'd like to acknowledge the Klondike Placer Mining Association, Schmidt Mining, Energy Mines and Resources, Department of Environment, all of the Indian River miners that participated in this, as well as Ducks Unlimited, who did a short study trying to enhance wetland reclamation by placer miners, as well as all these photo credits. And here's another example from the air, from Stuart's airplane, looking down on post-mine areas that have reclaimed naturally, and you can see what a wonderful job of nature has done and how much better we could do. We could make all those gravel piles green, and we could make the ponds much better habitat for waterfowl and beavers and muskrats and moose. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd be very pleased to get questions from the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clarkson. A very effective overview of the challenges and constraints facing the mining industry. We appreciate the work you've done here. And thank you for the overview of the best management practices that we're familiar with from the that have been adopted by the KPMA. We will take a moment to ask a few questions, and if you're willing, we may follow up with some written queries later, which you can, if you at your will, if you wish, you can respond to over the next few weeks. In any case, let's ask members if they have questions at this moment. Mr. Wormsby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Clarkson. Just a quick, well, maybe not a quick question, but just a single question. Looking at the questions the board posed to interveners, I think you've answered two, and your presentation obviously focused primarily on question 3, which I think will be very helpful to the board. But you touched upon in your intervention that the guidelines, that the Palmer Group guidelines and the guidelines that have been developed by the board for information in wetlands are too detailed, might not be effectively implementable by placer miners. Can you give some examples of the type of specific types of information that would be required that can be required to support a balanced approach from the board, while simplifying simplifying those guidelines, as you mentioned, some specific actions or details that might be useful? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that the area to be mined, if it has wetlands, it should be mapped so that you have an idea of what is there and what will be changed. I don't think the board would consider issuing a license without that. And that said, I think that we could develop a booklet like the DFO booklet that would allow people to go out in the field and do their own classification of wetlands. Some would hire specialists to do it, and others may be able to get over that learning curve and figure out which type of wetlands they were there. You can map them with a handheld GPS if necessary and come up with the areas relatively easily. Some miners wouldn't be able to do that, but some would be. And I keep hearing this talk about thresholds and the numbers that Jeff Bond has suggested in his PIM satellite imaging shows that the levels of disturbance are quite low. I'm not an expert on what levels of disturbance would warrant changes or limits to placer miners, but I would think that the board would at least grandfather existing licenses from that, and that they would look at some of the other methods to determine when a significant change is going to occur on a regional scale rather than on a per length of stream scale. That answers your question.
So it certainly gives us some helpful information. Thank you.
Other questions? I have a quick question, Mr. Clarkson. As you know, the decision document terms now are starting to call for the complete avoidance of mining in bogs and percentage of fens. Do you find that to be practical, a practical requirement? Do you think it's necessary? And if so, what information do you think would be required in order to make to realize that decision document term?
You know, what the mines are creating when it's done properly through wetland reclamation and best management practices, most rare types of wetlands in the Yukon territory and in Canada in general, marsh and shallow water wetlands, create a great diversity. In terms of do I support the 40% and no bogs rule, I don't think it's a practical thing to do. It would depend on the size of the bog and for instance, if you had a tiny bog in the middle of a large area, I don't know how you would mine around it and without some effect. I think we should look at each license holder and see what he has mapped or has had mapped for wetlands on his claims, and if the board feels that they need to save some of these wetlands or stop some of the wetlands from being mining, I guess they can apply a percentage, but I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think we're at that point in time. I don't think we're at that point in disturbance yet.
Okay. Mr. Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carl Sidney, member of the Water Board. Thank you, Randy, for your presentation. During some of our deliberations, we do our best to try to accommodate the applicants, but we will. In the last couple of days, we had presentations, but nobody's ever talked about a buffer. But we have the discussion at our deliberations, and I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit about how effective a buffer is in regards to protecting the water from not actually draining all the way while the applicant is doing their work. Thank you.
I think one of the biggest concerns people have with adjacent wetlands adjacent to development is affecting the saturation of the flow through the wetland. And in the larger scales, like the picture I have on the screen here, the wetlands on the sides and in the middle of the developments survive okay. From McKenna's maps, the swamps and the fens go right down to the edges of the disturbance, like I do in the photographs here. But I would be concerned if you had like a bog in the middle of those shallow water wetlands, and if you didn't have a high water table, I think about it, you might have trouble. You might water the bog in that shape. So you know, it's hard to say, but generally what we've seen is this picture here is the pre-existing wetlands. They're mined right up against them, and they maintain their functions. They seem to maintain their moisture content. They seem to maintain the vegetation. Again, that's backed up by Kieran's maps. look at her maps. And vast areas that have been mined, there's vast areas that haven't been mined, and where there seems to be a very sharp delineation between the pre-existing wetlands, which are still there, and the mined areas, which in some cases have been reclaimed, in some cases they haven't. And it really bothers me that they all haven't been reclaimed, that we need to sit down and go over some standard rules and make it straightforward. I mean, these are complex systems, but already Mother Nature is reclaiming them with or without us. And we can do a lot better job if we can give the miners instructions, enforceable instructions, and train the inspectors so that they make sure the miners do this work. And it will improve the industry, it will improve the habitat for everybody. To me, it's a win-win. It's a different type of wetland. I admit that it has to be a different type of wetland. It's a highly productive wetland. The moose aren't going to be exactly where they were 3,000 years ago. The berries aren't going to be where they were 3,000 years ago. There might be more beavers, but they're not going to be where they were 1,000 years ago. They might be in a different place. Because mining does change the landscape. It puts hills in it. It puts little ponds in it. It changes the type of wetland. It's a very productive wetland. There's lots of moose hunters go to the Indian River Valley and hunt moose in that area. There's lots of beavers in the area. I've seen them, but they're not in the same places as many of the elders would remember them, and that might be part of their frustrations.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Bowen. I'm not sure, Randy, if you were available to listen in on Ducks Unlimited's presentation earlier. They spoke to the application of peatland reclamation techniques and, in fact, the potential for peatland and permafrost reclamation. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, if such objectives are reasonable and to be employed in the Yukon, and or if you think that such measures would be perhaps cost prohibitive. Thank you.
I think it's a combination of both. When we first started doing research and reclamation, Anne and I, we looked a lot in Alaska and in northern Alberta, and we also looked in the south because most of the reclamation information is from the south. And if you want to reclaim a peatland where you've harvested for like horticultural purposes, and you've taken off a foot or two or maybe a meter off of a 5 meter peatland, that's very easy to reclaim. It come back quite quickly. To disturb it down to bedrock, that's another challenge. And if you have permafrost, it's yet another challenge to overcome. And you saw one of my earlier slides that said, basically says, why would you beat yourself up trying to do something which even multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies with larger technical and financial resources were unable to do? We did come across a recipe where you flattened off the whole area. You got a lot of hay and straw. I think it was a meter or thick or 2 meters thick, and then you put fertilizer and soil on it, and then you undisturbed wetland, and you harvested the top foot or two of off of it and placed it on top, and then you had to put a dike across the valley to flood it, and you had to put a control gate on the dike to make sure that the water level remained fairly constant in the fen or bog that you were trying to reclaim. And then there was no guarantee of success. There was very high rates of failure, even in southern Canada and the United States, with this type of method. So we did consider that. And not only was it cost prohibitive, it also had a very high failure rate. And I mean, you've got to haul that hay up from somewhere. You've got to put in a dike across the valley to flood it. You've got to have someone there to that dike when you get a storm event or a washout. You've got to have somebody there adjusting the gates. We wanted to have a plan where you didn't have to fiddle with that wetlands again, once you built it, it was done. The beavers will come in and muskrats will come in. But freezing and thaw, forest fires will change it, but you don't have to come in again. Most of the ones we saw were very high maintenance. The literature were very high maintenance, and they had the ones that did survive, and they had a very high failure record. And you see a lot of studies out there about reclaimed lands and how they don't come up to snuff on this, and they don't come up to snuff on that, and how they're efficient in this other way. And we come across people who are saying, well, you know, if you're going to alter a peat land, a hectare of marsh and shallow water wetland, we can't do that because we have to create pit for the shallow water wetland, and the material from that pit has to go somewhere. And it ends up being in a low hill surrounding these marsh and shallow water wetlands. And that's actually a good thing, as I mentioned earlier, because it provides some privacy in these little ponds. The pond outside my house, for instance, it only ever has one nesting pair of mallards. And many species of waterfowl, they won't allow another nesting pair in their area. So if you can break that up and smaller ponds and put low hills on the side, you'll get a lot more nesting pairs in that area. And you'll even see in our pond for the first 2 weeks of spring, there's some tremendous fighting going on between the different waterfowl as they fight for dominance on the coastal trade. So by making lots of small ponds and hills, it better have more productive.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Ms. Lucky.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Randy. I want to go back to, I think it might have been your first slide where you talked about the information should be conceptual in nature. The information provided should be conceptual in nature because of changing mining plans as people go about the business of mining. One of the things we've heard numerous times in the last couple of days is about the need for a precautionary approach, balancing the fact that there is an absence of mapping, there's an absence of planning. What we know about an area is limited. I'm not that familiar with the KPMA best management practices, but I guess my question is there something in perhaps those best management practices or something that you think would help us balance between that precautionary approach and that conceptual concept of an application?
I think what would be really, the short answer is no. But I think what we have to do is, like I say, if we hadn't been doing this for 100 years, we could be concerned. A few years ago, there was a consultant came up and he said, oh my God, you're mining in these narrow gulches, they're permafrost, you're going to destroy the permafrost, they're going to weep soils and sediment down forever, and it's going to be a terrible mess. Well, we said, well, no, they don't. They actually, the moss and the spruce trees slowly creep down the slope and it restores it nicely. And we have been mining these gulches for over 100 years, and we knew how they reacted. And we can do the same here. I think it'd be useful for people, for the government or for the water board or something, to hire someone with local expertise to go out and look at these areas and see them. We don't have to use a crystal ball. We have the actual wetlands in front of us. We can estimate from Anne's work how much has been converted, or not Anne's work, sorry, Karen McKenna's work, how much has been disturbed, how much remains. We we can certainly do a whole lot better job of enhancing reclamation, getting rid of the gravel piles and so on. But if you're looking for a threshold, I can't offer that to you, but I would say that Mr. Bond's work shows that we are very, very small on the scale of disturbance in terms of area of wetlands and in terms of total land area in the Klondike Plateau and the Klondike Wet'suwet'en traditional territory. I hope that helps. Helps you. I don't know.
No, it's just, it's the balance, right, of what the board is trying to do.
It is a balance, and the price of gold is very high right now. I mean, and we have an industry which is very old as well, and we have a lifestyle which is very old, and we have a very significant part of the economy. And right now you're at a crossroads, and I don't envy you because you have some choices, and some of them are not very easy choices to make. You know, if you do install the Palmer guidelines and you interpret them, you know, fairly rigorously, there's a lot of small miners which won't exist anymore. They can't do it. If you go with a standard set of conditions, it's going to be easy to enforce. Enforcement is a big part of the picture. If the miners don't learn how to reclaim wetlands and they're not, and the bad apples aren't forced to comply, then you're beat. So I think that's the approach we should take. At what point do we stop the conversion of peatland wetlands and swamp wetlands into marsh and shallow water wetlands? I can't tell you that, but I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, just based on Mr. Bond's work.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any further questions at this time? No? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Clarkson. Appreciate your work and your patience in answering our questions. So we may have more, so I thank you in advance for your patience in answering further questions. So thank you again.
You're most welcome, Mr. Chair. If you have any questions at all, send them on to me and I will respond to my best ability.
Okay, very good. Well, this brings us to the end of our second day, and I thank all participants from today. I think it's been a good day in terms of understanding many features of the challenges facing us. This will bring us to our final day, which we've set aside tomorrow. I remind people that we will begin at 8:45 in the morning. We have a couple of presentations, and then we'll begin our closing remarks from the various parties, and that will carry on for the balance of the day. So thank you all again, and look forward to seeing you bright and early in the morning at 8:45. We'll consider this meeting adjourned.